a lonely lord, a woman with a painful past, and a love that was never meant to be. In the heart of 19th century Romania, secrets will unravel, hearts will break, and destiny will take an unexpected turn. Will love conquer the impossible? Watch until the end to find out. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what makes you love these stories so much? The storm unleashed its fury across the Transylvanian countryside as Mara Dobre's carriage approached the imposing silhouette of Ionescu Manor. Lightning cleaved the darkness, briefly illuminating the Gothic architecture that loomed against the night sky like a beast waiting to devour unwary travelers. Rain lashed against the carriage windows, mirroring the tears Mara had promised herself she would never shed again. At 37, Mara had known more sorrow than most. The weight of her past pressed against her chest, threatening to suffocate her with each breath. She clutched her worn leather satchel, all that remained of her previous life, and steeled herself for what lay ahead. This position as head housekeeper was not merely employment, it was her last chance at redemption. As the carriage wheels crunched on the gravel driveway, Mara caught her reflection in the rain-streaked glass. Time had been kind to her features. High cheekbones, expressive hazel eyes, and rich chestnut hair now streaked with dignified silver at the temples. But those eyes had grown wary, guarded against further disappointment. "We've arrived, madam," the driver announced, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Ionescu Manor, God help you." The ominous addition sent a chill through Mara's spine. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. But the driver merely shook his head, refusing to elaborate. The grand entrance doors swung open before Mara could knock, revealing an elderly butler whose face seemed permanently frozen in disapproval. His eyes swept over her rain-soaked appearance, his lip curling slightly. "Miss Dobre, I presume," he said, his tone as cold as the marble floor beneath them. "I am Vasile, head butler. You're late." "The storm delayed the carriage," Mara explained, stepping into the cavernous entrance hall. Water dripped from her cloak onto the polished floor, each drop seeming to echo accusingly in the silence. "Lord Ionescu does not tolerate excuses," Vasile replied. "The staff quarters are this way. You will begin your duties at dawn tomorrow." As Mara followed the butler through dimly lit corridors, she felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her. The mansion seemed to breathe around them, walls whispering secrets too terrible to voice aloud. Portraits of stern-faced Ionescu ancestors gazed down at her, their painted eyes following her progress. "Is Lord Ionescu in residence?" Mara asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "The master is always in residence," Vasile replied cryptically, though many wish he were not. Before Mara could question this strange statement, they arrived at a small but clean chamber that would serve as her quarters. Vasile handed her a heavy iron key. "You will meet the other staff at breakfast. As head housekeeper, you oversee the maids and the upkeep of the main living areas. Under no circumstances are you to enter the west wing. Those are the master's private chambers, and strictly forbidden." Mara nodded, suppressing the shiver that ran down her spine. "When will I meet Lord Ionescu?" Vasile's expression darkened. "The master will summon you when he wishes. Do not seek him out." With that, he turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "A word of advice, Miss Dobre. The previous 5 housekeepers lasted less than a month each. Whatever you've heard about Lord Ionescu, it doesn't capture the half of it." Alone in her chamber, Mara unpacked her meager belongings, placing a small, worn portrait frame face down in a drawer. Some memories were too painful to face each night. Outside, thunder cracked, and Mara jumped as her window rattled violently in its frame. Sleep eluded her that night. The storm raged on, and beneath it, Mara could swear she heard footsteps pacing in the corridor, stopping occasionally outside her door. Once, she thought she heard a man's ragged breathing, as though someone stood just beyond the threshold listening. Dawn came with merciful clarity. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. Mara dressed in her modest black dress, pinning her hair into a severe bun that emphasized her elegant neck. She would face whatever awaited her with dignity, if not confidence. The other servants greeted her with curious but guarded expressions. They answered her questions with monosyllables, exchanging meaningful glances when they thought she wasn't looking. No one spoke of the master unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, it was in hushed, fearful tones. By midday, Mara had toured most of the permitted areas of the house. The mansion was grand but neglected, beautiful furnishings covered in dust, windows shuttered against the daylight. It was as though the house itself was in mourning. It was while inspecting the library that Mara first felt it, that peculiar sensation of being watched. She turned sharply, her heart leaping to her throat. A man stood in the shadows by the door, tall and imposing. Though no more than 45, pain had carved deep lines into his aristocratic features. His eyes, dark as midnight, bore into her with an intensity that stole her breath. He was handsome in a harsh, uncompromising way, like a statue carved from granite rather than marble. "Lord Ionescu," Mara said, cursing the tremor in her voice as she curtsied deeply. "So you're the new one," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble that spoke of disuse. He stepped forward into a shaft of light that had managed to penetrate the heavy curtains. A jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw on the left side, pulling slightly at the corner of his mouth in what might be mistaken for a perpetual sneer. "Yes, my lord. Mara Dobre." "They never last," he said, more to himself than to her. His gaze traveled over her face, her figure, assessing her as one might a horse at auction. "What brings you to this cursed place, Mara Dobre? Running from something, or someone?" The uncanny accuracy of his assumption caused her to take a step back. "I needed employment, my lord." A humorless smile twisted his lips. "There are dozens of noble houses that would employ a woman of your evident quality. Yet you choose the one that no servant will approach willingly. Interesting." He moved toward her with the fluid grace of a predator, stopping only when they were separated by less than an arm's length. Mara held her ground, though every instinct screamed for her to flee. "Let me make something perfectly clear," he said, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "Your presence here changes nothing. You will perform your duties without question. You will not pry into matters that don't concern you. And above all, you will not attempt to know me." The last words were spoken with such vehemence that Mara flinched despite herself. "Do I frighten you, Miss Dobre?" he asked, something unreadable flickering across his features. Mara straightened her spine, meeting his gaze directly. "No, my lord. I have known true fear in my life. You do not compare." For a moment, genuine surprise registered in his eyes, quickly replaced by something that might have been respect. Then his expression hardened once more. "We shall see," he said quietly. "Before long, you'll flee this house like all the others. There are ghosts within these walls that cannot be exorcised by a mere housekeeper, no matter how intriguing." With that, he turned and strode from the room, leaving Mara trembling, not with fear but with a sudden inexplicable certainty that her life had just changed irrevocably. That night, as she lay in her bed listening to the house settle around her, Mara wondered what tragedy had shaped the man she had met today. Lord Adrian Ionescu was clearly haunted, not by supernatural specters, but by demons of his own making. And despite his warnings, despite every instinct for self-preservation, Mara found herself drawn to the mystery he presented. Little did she know that beyond her door, in the shadows of the corridor, Adrian Ionescu stood once more, his hand raised as if to knock, before turning away with a curse. The game had begun, though neither yet understood the rules or the devastating price of losing. 3 weeks had passed since Mara's arrival at Ionescu Manor, and the tension between her and Lord Adrian had only intensified. Each morning she rose before dawn to organize the day's tasks, determined to restore order to the neglected mansion. The other servants had gradually warmed to her firm but fair leadership, though whispers about the master's unusual interest in the new housekeeper circulated below stairs. The autumn chill had settled over the Carpathian foothills, painting the surrounding forests in brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Mara stood at the library window, dusting shelves while stealing glances at the magnificent view. The manor's grounds stretched toward the mountains, a landscape both beautiful and forbidding. "Admiring my property, Miss Dobry?" The deep voice startled her, though she'd grown somewhat accustomed to Lord Adrian's habit of appearing silently. Mara turned, maintaining her composure. "The view is breathtaking, my lord." Adrian stood in the doorway, impeccably dressed in a dark tailcoat that accentuated his broad shoulders. In the weeks since their first encounter, Mara had noticed how he always positioned himself to hide the scarred side of his face. "My grandfather chose this location deliberately," he said, approaching slowly. He claimed the mountains offered protection, though from what, he never specified. His gaze swept over the bookshelves she had organized. "You've been busy." The library needed attention. Mara continued her work, refusing to be intimidated by his presence. "These books deserve better care than they've received." His eyes narrowed. "Are you criticizing my household management, Miss Dobry?" "Merely stating facts, my lord." She met his gaze without flinching. A house reflects its master's state of mind. The air between them crackled with unspoken challenge. Adrian's jaw tightened, but something like reluctant amusement flickered in his eyes. "And what does this house tell you about me?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. Mara hesitated, knowing she was treading on perilous ground. "That you're a man who once cared deeply about beautiful things, but no longer sees their value." Adrian's expression darkened. He stepped closer, close enough that Mara could detect the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that seemed to cling to him. "You presume too much," he said coldly. "Finish your duties and leave. I wish to read in solitude." Mara cursed silently at her own boldness. She gathered her cleaning supplies and moved toward the door, but Adrian's voice stopped her. "The autumn ball at Count Dragomir's estate is tomorrow evening. As lord of this region, I've received an invitation." He spoke with his back to her, staring out at the mountains. "Prepare my formal attire." "Will you be attending, my lord?" Mara asked, surprised. From the servants' gossip, she'd learned that Adrian had become a recluse, avoiding all social gatherings for years. "No," he replied shortly, "but appearances must be maintained. I'll send a gift and my regrets." Later that afternoon, as Mara inspected Adrian's formal clothes, she found Vasile watching her with his perpetually disapproving expression. "The master hasn't attended a social function in 7 years, the butler remarked. "Not since the incident." Mara paused in her work. "What incident?" Vasile's thin lips pressed together. "It's not my place to say, but the scar he bears is merely the visible wound." He turned to leave, then added, "Count Dragomir's son was once the master's closest friend. Now even the mention of the Dragomir name sends him into darkness." That evening, a commotion in the entrance hall drew Mara from the kitchen. A messenger from the Dragomir estate stood dripping rain onto the marble floor, clutching a gilt-edged envelope. "Count Dragomir insists upon Lord Ionescu's attendance," the young man explained nervously to Vasile. "He says the matter concerns both their families' honor." From the shadows of the grand staircase, Adrian appeared, his expression thunderous. "Give me the letter," he commanded, snatching the envelope from the messenger's hand. As he read, his face grew pale beneath his tan. Without a word, he crumpled the paper and threw it into the fire burning in the entrance hall hearth. "Tell your master I will not be manipulated," Adrian growled. "The past is dead." The messenger bowed hastily and retreated into the stormy night. Adrian stood motionless, staring into the flames. Only when he turned did he notice Mara's presence. "Was there something you needed, Miss Dobry?" His voice was razor-sharp. "No, my lord. I merely wondered if there would be a change in plans regarding tomorrow's ball." His laugh was bitter. "Curious about the master's business, are we? First my mental state, now my social obligations. What else would you like to pry into?" Mara straightened. "Forgive me, my lord. I only wish to know if I should continue preparing your formal wear." Adrian approached her slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "The clothes won't be necessary. I have no intention of dancing while Dragomir parades his so-called honor." "As you wish." Mara turned to leave, but his next word stopped her cold. "Why do you not fear me, Mara Dobry?" The question held genuine puzzlement. "The others scurry away like mice when I approach. yet you stand your ground. Mara considered her answer carefully. Perhaps because I recognize that anger is often a mask for pain, my lord. Fury flashed across his features. You know nothing of my pain. No, she agreed softly, but I know my own. Something shifted in his expression, surprise, perhaps even a reluctant curiosity. The moment stretched between them, tense with unspoken possibilities. The spell was broken by Vasile's reappearance. My lord, there's a matter requiring your attention in the study. Adrian's expression closed like a shuttered window. We're finished here, he told Mara curtly, then followed Vasile upstairs. The next evening, despite Adrian's declaration, Mara found herself in the garden, seeking solace among the overgrown roses. The distant sounds of music carried on the night breeze. The Dragomir ball was clearly audible even from this distance. Should you not be attending to your duties, Miss Dobré? Adrian's voice came from the garden path. He stood in formal evening wear, a striking figure against the moonlit landscape. Mara couldn't hide her surprise. I thought you weren't attending the ball. A muscle twitched in his jaw. I reconsidered. Some challenges must be faced directly. That's courageous of you, my lord. Adrian's laugh was hollow. Not courage. Pride, perhaps, or foolishness. He approached, studying her face in the moonlight. Why do you hide in the gardens at this hour? I'm not hiding, Mara replied. I'm remembering. What could a servant possibly need to remember with such melancholy? His tone was mocking, but his eyes watched her intently. The question stung. Servants have hearts too, my lord. We love, we lose, we remember, just as nobles do. For a moment, Adrian seemed taken aback by her response. You speak as though you weren't born to service. Mara turned away. We are all serving something or someone, my lord, even you. His hand caught her arm, turning her back to face him. What do you mean by that? You serve your bitterness, she said softly. Your pain. It commands you more surely than any master. Adrian's fingers tightened on her arm, anger flashing in his eyes. For a heartbeat, Mara thought he might strike her. Instead, he released her suddenly as if her skin had burned him. You forget yourself, he said coldly. Remember your place. My place is wherever I choose to make it, Mara replied, the words escaping before she could stop them. Adrian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming in the confined space between hedgerows. Why are you here, in my house, challenging me at every turn? What do you want from me? The raw emotion in his voice startled her. I want nothing from you except the respect due to any human being. Their eyes locked in silent battle, neither willing to retreat. The tension between them had transformed into something dangerous, electric. Go inside, Adrian finally ordered, his voice rough, before we both say things we'll regret. Mara hesitated, then curtsied stiffly. Enjoy the ball, my lord. As she walked away, she felt his eyes following her, burning with questions neither of them was ready to answer. Adrian watched her disappear into the house, his planned departure forgotten. He unclenched his fists slowly, disturbed by the effect this woman had on him. No servant had ever dared speak to him with such boldness, such insight. Who are you really, Mara Dobré? He whispered to the empty garden. And why do I feel as though you see straight through the walls I've built? The music from the distant ball faded as clouds obscured the moon. Adrian turned away from the path to the stables, his decision made. The Dragomirs would wait another day for their confrontation. Tonight, he had a greater mystery to contemplate. The gray November skies hung low over Ionescu Manor, mirroring the somber mood that had settled over the household. Nearly 6 weeks had passed since Mara's arrival, and while the manor itself had begun to transform under her capable direction, dust banished from long-neglected corners, windows gleaming once more. The master of the house remained as inscrutable as ever. Adrian had vanished into his private wing after their confrontation in the garden, emerging only for solitary meals or late-night wanderings through the halls. The servants whispered that he was brooding more intensely than usual, though none dared question why. Mara stood at the grand entrance, accepting the day's post from the village courier. Among the business correspondence and invitations addressed to Lord Ionescu was a small, weather-worn envelope addressed to her in an unfamiliar hand. She tucked it into her pocket, intending to read it in private later. "Is there anything urgent requiring my attention?" Adrian's voice startled her as he descended the main staircase, looking more rested than she had seen him in weeks. "Nothing that appears time-sensitive, my lord," Mara replied, handing him the stack of correspondence. Their fingers brushed momentarily, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. Adrian's eyes flickered to her face, then quickly away. "You've done well with the house," he said, his tone almost conversational. I had forgotten how the marble in the entry hall could shine. Surprised by the compliment, Mara inclined her head. "Thank you, my lord. The manor deserves proper care." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "And you believe everything deserves proper care, don't you, Miss Dobre? Even surly masters who snap at housekeepers." Before Mara could formulate a response to this unexpected glimpse of self-awareness, Vasily appeared at Adrian's elbow. "Count Dragomir's son has arrived, my lord. He insists upon seeing you." Adrian's expression instantly hardened. "I left specific instructions that I was not receiving visitors." "He threatened to create a scene, my lord," Vasily said, disapproval evident in his tone. "He waits in the blue salon." Adrian's jaw clenched. "Very well, show him to my study instead. I won't have him making himself comfortable." He turned to Mara. "Bring us brandy, then ensure we are not disturbed." 20 minutes later, Mara approached the study with the requested refreshments. Raised voices filtered through the heavy oak door. 7 years of this childish feud." The stranger's voice was cultured but heated. "My father is dying, Adrian. Whatever happened between you two, surely it's time to end this ridiculous estrangement." "Your father made his position quite clear," Adrian responded coldly. "He chose to believe the worst of me without a moment's hesitation. Because you refused to defend yourself. You simply disappeared behind these walls like a wounded animal." Something crashed against a wall. A glass or paperweight, Mara guessed. She hesitated, unsure whether to interrupt. "Get out, Nikolai." Adrian's voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Your father's deathbed manipulations won't work on me. He made his choice. Now I've made mine." Mara knocked firmly before the argument could escalate further. After a moment of pointed silence, Adrian called for her to enter. The study was thick with tension. Adrian stood by the window, his back rigid, while a handsome man approximately his age occupied the center of the room. Despite their apparent animosity, the resemblance between them was striking. They might have been brothers rather than childhood friends. "Your brandy, my lord?" Mara said, placing the tray on a side table. Nikolai Dragomir's eyes swept over her with undisguised interest. "You've finally hired staff with some refinement, I see. A pleasant change from the usual village girls." Adrian turned sharply. "Miss Dobre is my housekeeper. Not a topic for your commentary, Nikolai." Dragomir raised an eyebrow. "Protective of the help now? How interesting." He bowed slightly toward Mara. "Forgive me, Miss Dobre. I meant no offense." "None taken, sir," Mara replied evenly, though she found his appraising gaze unsettling. "That will be all." Adrian dismissed her, but as she turned to leave, Nikolai spoke again. "Actually, I was just departing myself. Perhaps you might show me out, Miss Dobre. I'd hate to take more of Lord Ionescu's precious time." Adrian's expression darkened, but before he could object, Nikolai had offered Mara his arm and steered her toward the door. She had little choice but to comply without creating a scene. In the corridor, Nikolai released her arm, but didn't immediately proceed toward the exit. "How long have you been employed here, Miss Dobre?" "Nearly 2 months, sir." "Remarkable. The longest any housekeeper has lasted in years." His eyes studied her face. "What's your secret?" Mara maintained her professional demeanor. "I simply do my job, sir." Nikolai chuckled. No one simply does anything around Adrian Ionescu. He's a force of nature, or used to be, before he became this shadow of himself. He lowered his voice conspirationally. "Has he told you why he hides away? Why he wears that scar like a badge of shame?" "It would not be my place to ask, sir." "No, I suppose not." Nikolai sighed. "A pity. Adrian was once the most brilliant man in our circle, charming, fearless. Now he gestured vaguely. Well, you see what he's become. They had reached the entrance hall. Mara opened the heavy front door, anxious to conclude this uncomfortable exchange. Nikolai paused on the threshold. If you last another month, Miss Dobre, you'll have accomplished something truly extraordinary, though I wonder at what cost. With a final enigmatic smile, he departed. Later that evening, alone in her chamber, Mara finally remembered the letter in her pocket. She broke the seal and unfolded the single page, scanning the unfamiliar handwriting. As she read, the blood drained from her face. The words blurred before her eyes. Evidence that your son may still be alive. A boy matching his description was seen in a village near Bucharest. Urgent, you come immediately. The letter slipped from Mara's trembling fingers. Her son, her Petru, possibly alive after all these years? It couldn't be. She had grieved him, buried her hopes along with what she believed was his tiny body. To resurrect that hope now seemed almost cruel. Yet, if there was even the slightest chance. A storm had gathered outside, rain lashing against the windows as thunder rolled across the mountains. Mara paced her small room, the letter clutched in her hand, her mind racing with impossible possibilities. She needed to leave immediately. She needed to know the truth. But how could she abandon her position without notice? Lord Ionescu would never permit such a breach of contract, and she desperately needed this employment. Lightning illuminated the room in stark white flashes as Mara's tears finally fell, the first she had allowed herself in months. Overwhelmed by emotion and indecision, she left her chamber and descended to the grand salon, hoping the larger space might help clear her thoughts. The vast room was dark save for the intermittent lightning. Mara stood before the tall windows, watching the storm rage across the estate, unaware that she was not alone until a voice spoke from the shadows. Insomnia seems to plague us both tonight. Mara whirled to find Adrian seated in a high-backed chair near the cold fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "Forgive me, my lord," she said quickly, wiping at her tears. "I didn't realize anyone was here." Adrian studied her in the darkness. "You've been crying." It wasn't a question, and Mara didn't bother denying it. "Yes." "I wouldn't have taken you for the weeping type, Miss Dobre." His tone wasn't unkind, merely curious. "What tragedy has befallen you that tears are your only solace?" Perhaps it was the darkness, perhaps the emotional turmoil of the letter, but Mara found herself answering honestly. "A ghost from my past has returned to haunt me." Adrian shifted in his chair, the lightning briefly illuminating his scarred face. "Ghosts," he repeated softly. "Yes, I know something of those." A particularly loud crack of thunder made Mara flinch. Adrian rose and moved to stand beside her at the window. "What manner of ghost drives a woman of your strength to tears in the dead of night?" he asked, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. Mara clutched the letter tightly. "My son," she whispered. "I thought him dead these past 5 years. Now I don't know what to believe." Adrian's sharp intake of breath betrayed his surprise. "You have a child?" "Had," Mara corrected automatically, then faltered. "Perhaps still have. I don't know." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the storm. When Adrian spoke again, his voice held an odd tension. "Is that why you came here? A widow seeking refuge?" "Not a widow," Mara said quietly. "I was never married." Instead of the judgment or disgust she half expected, Adrian merely nodded. "And the father?" "A nobleman who promised everything and delivered nothing," Mara replied bitterly. "A common enough story. Not so common for a woman to raise a child alone without family support," Adrian observed. "That requires unusual courage." Mara turned to look at him, surprised by his understanding. In the darkness, with the scar hidden in shadow, his face seemed younger, unburdened by whatever pain had etched those harsh lines. "Why have you never left this place?" she asked impulsively. "What holds you here, surrounded by painful memories?" Adrian's expression closed immediately. "We were discussing your ghosts, not mine, Miss Dobry." Perhaps they're not so different, Mara suggested softly. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered in Adrian's eyes, a glimpse of the man he might once have been. Then the shutters came down again. "Get some rest," he said, turning away. "Whatever your letter contains, it will seem clearer in the morning light." As he reached the doorway, he paused. "And Mara," he said, using her first name for the first time, "if you need to leave, to seek answers, arrangements can be made." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone with the storm and the impossible hope that had reawakened in her heart. Dawn broke over Ionescu Manor with unexpected clarity after the night's tempest. Mara stood in Adrian's study, facing him across the massive oak desk that had served generations of his family. Though she had barely slept, determination steadied her voice. "I need a fortnight's leave, my lord," she stated, meeting his gaze directly. "Family matters require my attention in Bucharest." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable. In the morning light, the scar along his jaw appeared less severe, though the hardness in his eyes remained. "This concerns the letter you received yesterday? The one about your son?" Mara nodded, unsure whether to be touched or unnerved that he remembered their midnight conversation so precisely. "I understand your urgency," Adrian said after a moment, "but winter approaches quickly in the Carpathians. Travel will be dangerous, especially for a woman alone." "I've faced worse dangers," Mara replied steadily. Something like respect flickered in Adrian's eyes. "No doubt you have." He drummed his fingers on the desk, then seemed to reach a decision. "Take one of the estate horses, Stella, the chestnut mare. She's sure-footed on mountain paths." Mara hadn't expected such generosity. "Thank you, my lord. I'll return her safely." "See that you do." Adrian rose from his chair and moved to the window, his back to her. "And see that you return safely as well. Good housekeepers are difficult to replace." The comment might have been merely practical, but Mara detected something more in his tone, a concern he seemed reluctant to express directly. "I'll depart this afternoon," she said, "after ensuring the household duties are properly assigned during my absence." Adrian turned, his face half illuminated by the morning sun. "There's a property I own on the outskirts of Bucharest, a small townhouse on Strada Victoriae. It stands empty but maintained. You'll stay there rather than some questionable inn." Mara's pride bristled slightly. "That's not necessary, my lord. I can manage my own accommodations." A hint of the old arrogance returned to Adrian's expression. "It wasn't a suggestion, Miss Dobre. Vasile will provide the address and keys." His tone softened marginally. "Consider it part of your compensation for restoring some order to this mausoleum I call home." Their eyes held for a moment longer than propriety dictated, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Mara curtsied and turned to leave, but Adrian's voice stopped her at the door. "Whatever you discover in Bucharest, I hope it brings you peace, not further pain." The unexpected kindness caught Mara off guard. "Thank you," she replied softly, and slipped from the room before emotion could overwhelm her composure. By early afternoon, Mara had packed a small valise and given Vasile detailed instructions for the household in her absence. The elderly butler had raised an eyebrow at her departure but offered no commentary beyond practical advice about the journey. As she crossed the courtyard toward the stables, she was surprised to find Adrian himself checking the saddle on a beautiful chestnut mare. "I thought you'd have departed by now," he commented, tightening a strap with practiced ease. "I wanted to ensure everything was in order first," Mara explained, approaching the horse cautiously. Though she had ridden in her youth, it had been many years since she'd been astride. Adrian watched her appraising the mare. "Stella is gentle but spirited," he said, stroking the animal's neck. "Like someone else of my acquaintance." Mara glanced at him sharply, but his expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest. "The roads to the valley should be clear, but beyond that, keep to the main thoroughfares," Adrian continued. "There's money in the saddlebag, sufficient for any unexpected expenses." "My lord, I can't accept—" "Consider it an advance on your wages," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. Pride makes for cold comfort on a difficult journey, Miss Dobre. Mara wanted to protest further, but recognized the wisdom in his words. Very well, thank you. Adrian offered his hand to help her mount. Mara placed her fingers in his palm, startled by the strength and warmth of his grip as he effortlessly lifted her into the saddle. Their eyes met as she settled herself, and for a fleeting moment, the hardness in his gaze softened into something almost tender. Safe journey, he said simply, stepping back from the horse. Mara nodded, gathered the reins, and urged Stella forward. As she passed through the manor gates, she glanced back once. Adrian still stood in the courtyard, a solitary figure against the imposing backdrop of his ancestral home, watching her departure with an expression she couldn't decipher. The journey to the valley proceeded smoothly, the mare proving as sure-footed as promised on the mountain paths. Mara's mind raced with possibilities as the miles passed beneath Stella's hooves. Could it truly be possible that her Petru lived? After 5 years of mourning, could fate be so cruel or so kind as to return him to her? Lost in these thoughts, she failed to notice the darkening sky until the first fat raindrops splashed against her face. Within minutes, the gentle shower had transformed into a driving downpour that reduced visibility to mere feet ahead. Steady, girl, Mara murmured to Stella, who had grown skittish in the sudden storm. A flash of lightning startled the mare, who reared suddenly. Unprepared for the violent motion, Mara felt herself slipping from the saddle. She clutched desperately at the horse's mane, but the rain had made everything slick. With a cry of alarm, she tumbled backward, striking her head on something hard as she fell. Pain exploded behind her eyes, then darkness claimed her. Consciousness returned in fragments. First, the rhythmic swaying motion beneath her, then the pressure of strong arms holding her securely. Finally, a voice, low and urgent, speaking her name. Mara, Mara, can you hear me? She struggled to open her eyes, disoriented and confused. When her vision finally cleared, she found herself staring up at Adrian's face, his expression taut with concern. She was cradled against his chest as he rode, one arm holding her firmly, while the other guided his stallion through the rain. Lord Ionescu, she murmured, her voice weak even to her own ears. Relief visibly washed over his features. Thank God, I feared you wouldn't wake. Mara tried to sit up straighter but winced as pain lanced through her temple. What happened? How did you find me? I followed you, Adrian admitted, adjusting his hold to support her more comfortably. Something unsettled me after you left. Call it instinct or premonition. His jaw tightened. I arrived just as you fell. You struck your head on a boulder. Mara raised her hand to her temple, feeling the sticky warmth of blood. Stella is following behind, tethered to my horse, Adrian assured her. She's unharmed, merely frightened by the storm. The rain had lessened somewhat, allowing Mara to see that they were already approaching the manor gates. My journey to Bucharest will wait until you've recovered, Adrian said firmly. You may have a concussion. No argument on this point, Mara. Too weak to protest, she allowed herself to relax against his chest, noting distantly how naturally he had used her given name. The steady beat of his heart beneath her ear was oddly comforting. I didn't take you for the rescuing type, my lord, she murmured, fighting the darkness that threatened to engulf her consciousness again. She felt rather than saw his smile. There are many things you don't yet know about me, Mara Dobre. By the time they reached the manor, Mara was drifting in and out of awareness. She was vaguely conscious of being carried inside, of servants rushing to prepare her room, of Adrian barking orders to summon the doctor from the village. Her next clear memory was of lying in her chamber, the doctor, a grave-faced older man, examining the wound on her temple. A nasty blow, but not life-threatening, he pronounced, applying a stinging salve that made Mara wince. Rest for at least 3 days. No riding, no exertion. 3 days? Mara protested weakly. I can't delay. 5 days, Adrian countered from where he stood by the door, arms crossed. The doctor said at least 3. The doctor chuckled as he packed his instruments. I see you're in capable hands, Miss Dobre. Strict ones, but capable. He turned to Adrian. Send for me if her symptoms worsen. Watch for confusion or severe headaches. After the doctor departed, Adrian lingered in the doorway. Rain still dripped from his hair and clothing. He had apparently not taken time to change before ensuring she received medical attention. "You should dry yourself, my lord," Mara said softly. "I wouldn't want to be responsible for adding pneumonia to your burdens." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Always the caretaker, even when you're the one requiring care." He stepped into the room, stopping beside her bed. "You frightened me today, Mara." The admission, so simply stated, carried a weight that neither of them seemed prepared to acknowledge fully. "I'm sorry," she replied, "both for the fright and for the inconvenience." Adrian shook his head. "Don't apologize for circumstances beyond your control." He hesitated, then added, "I understand your urgency to reach Bucharest, but a few days' delay won't change what you find there." "Every day feels like an eternity when it concerns my son," Mara said, unable to keep the emotion from her voice. Adrian's expression softened. "I know. And I promise you'll make your journey as soon as you're able. Until then." He reached out hesitantly, then allowed his fingers to brush lightly against her hand. "Rest. Heal. I'll ensure everything is prepared for your departure." The simple touch sent an unexpected warmth through Mara's body. Their eyes met, and for a moment all the barriers between them, master and servant, nobleman and commoner, seemed to dissolve, leaving just a man and a woman connected by a touch that promised more than either dared articulate. Adrian withdrew his hand first, clearing his throat. "I should change," he said, his voice rougher than before. "Vasile will bring you something to eat shortly." "Thank you," Mara said simply, "for everything." At the doorway, Adrian paused, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Rest well, Mara." As he closed the door behind him, Mara realized that something fundamental had shifted between them. A spark ignited by danger and concern that couldn't easily be extinguished. Whether it would warm them or consume them remained to be seen. 4 days passed with Mara confined to her bed under Adrian's strict orders. The household ran in quiet efficiency around her, with the master himself making daily visits to her chamber to inquire after her recovery. These visits began as brief, almost clinical checks on her condition, but gradually lengthened as conversation flowed more naturally between them. On the 5th morning, Mara woke with renewed determination. The dizziness had subsided, and the wound on her temple had begun to heal cleanly. She dressed carefully in her plain black gown, pinning her hair with meticulous attention. If Adrian intended to delay her journey further, she would need all her strength to resist. To her surprise, she found him waiting for her in the breakfast room, a map spread before him on the table. "Good morning," he said, looking up as she entered. "You seem much improved." "I am fully recovered, my lord," Mara replied firmly, "and ready to resume my journey to Bucharest." Adrian studied her face carefully before nodding. "I suspected as much. That's why I've plotted a safer route for you." He gestured to the map. "The mountain pass you attempted before is treacherous even in good weather. This alternative path adds half a day to your journey but follows the river valley where settlements are more frequent." Mara approached the table, surprised by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. I've also arranged for one of my men to accompany you to the city limits," Adrian continued. "He'll return with Stella once you're settled in the townhouse." "That's not necessary," Mara began. "It wasn't a suggestion, Miss Dobre," Adrian interrupted, though his tone lacked its former harshness. "Consider it a condition of your continued employment." Their eyes met across the table, a silent contest of wills that ended with Mara's reluctant nod. "As you wish, my lord." "Good." Adrian rolled up the map and handed it to her. "You'll depart tomorrow at first light. Today you will rest and prepare." His tone softened slightly. "And perhaps join me for dinner this evening." Mara raised an eyebrow in surprise. "Join you? At your table?" "Unless you find the prospect too distasteful," Adrian replied, a hint of challenge in his voice. "Not distasteful," Mara said carefully, "merely unexpected." A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, crossed Adrian's face. "I find that I've grown accustomed to conversation during meals. Your absence these past days has been Notable. Before Mara could formulate a response to this unexpected admission, Adrian excused himself to attend to estate business, leaving her to wonder at the subtle but undeniable shift in their relationship. With a day of relative freedom ahead of her, Mara decided to organize her travel preparations. She was crossing the main hall when a maid emerged from the west wing, the forbidden section of the house that contained Adrian's private chambers. "Pardon, miss," the young woman said, curtsying nervously. "The master asked me to air out his study. I've finished now." "His study?" Mara repeated. "In the west wing?" The maid nodded. "Yes, miss. His private study, not the formal one downstairs." Curiosity prickled at Mara. While she had no intention of violating Adrian's privacy, the opportunity to glimpse the mysterious west wing was tempting. "I'll ensure the door is properly secured," she told the maid. "You may return to your regular duties." Once alone, Mara hesitated only briefly before approaching the heavy oak door the maid had left ajar. She told herself she merely intended to close it as promised, but when her gaze fell upon the room beyond, she found herself stepping inside. Adrian's private study was both exactly what she expected and surprisingly intimate. Rich wood paneling lined the walls, interspersed with bookshelves filled not with the leather-bound classics that populated the main library, but with well-worn volumes that showed frequent use. A massive desk dominated one wall, covered with papers and correspondence that spoke of active business dealings, a sharp contrast to the impression of isolated brooding that Adrian often projected. What caught Mara's attention, however, was a leather-bound book lying open on a side table near the window. Its pages were filled with handwriting she recognized as Adrian's, bold, slashing strokes that reflected his forceful personality. She knew she should leave immediately, but something about the book drew her closer. As she approached, she realized it wasn't a journal, but a collection of letters, all addressed to the same person. "My dearest Elisabetta." Mara's breath caught. Elisabetta, Adrian's missing wife. The servants had mentioned her only in whispers, never in the master's presence. Against her better judgment, Mara allowed her eyes to scan the open page. "Though 3 years have passed since your disappearance, I find myself still writing these letters you will never read. The investigators have found no trace of you beyond Vienna. Did you find the happiness abroad that eluded you here? Or did some misfortune befall you that I, in my stubborn pride, failed to prevent? The not knowing has become its own form of torture." The raw emotion in the words pierced Mara's heart. This was not the writing of a cruel or unfeeling man, but one tormented by loss and uncertainty. "What are you doing?" Adrian's voice, cold with fury, startled Mara so badly she nearly knocked over the side table. She whirled to find him standing in the doorway, his expression dark with betrayal. "My lord, Get out." The words were soft, but laced with dangerous anger. Mara stood her ground, though her heart pounded painfully. "I apologize for the intrusion. The maid left the door open, and You thought you'd satisfy your curiosity about the master's secrets?" Adrian advanced into the room, his eyes flashing. "Was that your intention all along? To worm your way into this household and pry into matters that don't concern you?" The unfair accusation stung. "No, I would never deliberately. Yet here you stand, reading my private correspondence." Adrian reached the table in 3 long strides, slamming the book closed with a force that made Mara flinch. "What gives you the right?" "Nothing," Mara admitted quietly. "I was wrong to enter without permission, but I was not spying on you, my lord." "No?" Adrian's laugh was harsh. "Then what would you call this invasion?" Mara lifted her chin. A moment of human weakness, of curiosity about a man who reveals so little of himself while demanding absolute loyalty. Adrian's expression darkened further. "You know nothing about me or what I demand." "Because you share nothing," Mara exclaimed, her own frustration finally breaking through. "You hide behind your anger and your pain, pushing away anyone who might see the man beneath." "And what man do you imagine that to be?" Adrian asked, his voice dangerously soft as he stepped closer. "Some wounded soul in need of redemption? Some misunderstood hero from your romantic imaginings?" They were standing so close now that Mara could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "No," she said quietly. "Just a man. One who has suffered and survived, as we all must." Something shifted in Adrian's expression, the fury giving way to something more complex, more vulnerable. His gaze dropped to the book on the table. "She left," he said after a moment, his voice stripped of its earlier anger. "My wife disappeared without a word, leaving only rumors and speculation in her wake." His jaw tightened. "Some said she fled my cruelty. Others that she found a lover more to her liking." Mara remained silent, sensing that any interruption might cause Adrian to retreat back behind his walls. "I searched for 3 years," he continued, moving to the window. "Hired investigators, traveled across Europe myself. Nothing. No body, no confirmation of whether she lives or died." His hands clenched at his sides. "The not knowing is an open wound that refuses to heal." "The letters," Mara said softly. "You still write to her?" Adrian nodded without turning. "A foolish habit I cannot seem to break. Words I cannot say aloud, addressed to a ghost." Mara took a careful step toward him. "That's not foolish. It's human." "Is it?" Adrian turned to face her, and the naked pain in his eyes made her heart clench. "Or is it merely the desperate grasping of a man unable to accept that he was never loved as he believed?" "I don't know," Mara admitted, "but I understand the need to speak to those who are lost to us. After I thought my son had died, I spoke to him every night for a year." Adrian's expression softened slightly. "I had forgotten momentarily that you too carry ghosts." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We make quite the pair, don't we? Both haunted by absences we cannot fill." The casual grouping of them as a pair sent an unexpected warmth through Mara's chest. Before she could respond, Adrian closed the distance between them in 2 swift strides. "I should not have accused you so harshly," he said, his voice low. "My reaction was excessive." "You were protecting your privacy," Mara replied. "I was the one at fault." They stood in silence for a moment, neither quite ready to step away. Mara was acutely aware of how improper their proximity was, yet she couldn't bring herself to move. "You still intend to search for your son?" Adrian asked finally. Mara nodded. "I must know the truth, whatever it may be." "Yes," Adrian said softly. "I understand that need better than most." His eyes searched her face, settling briefly on her lips before returning to meet her gaze. "Mara, Whatever he intended to say was interrupted by the sudden movement of his hand, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. The simple touch seemed to startle them both. Adrian's fingers lingered against her cheek, and Mara found herself leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. The moment hung suspended between them, taut with possibility. Then, with a sudden decisiveness that took Mara's breath away, Adrian bent and captured her lips with his. The kiss was brief but intense, a claiming, a question, and a revelation all at once. Mara's hands moved instinctively to his shoulders, whether to push him away or draw him closer, she couldn't say. Adrian broke the contact first, stepping back as if burned. Shock registered on his features, quickly followed by something like horror. "Forgive me," he said hoarsely. "I had no right." Before Mara could respond, he turned and strode from the room, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the lingering warmth of his touch upon her lips. Mara raised trembling fingers to her mouth, the reality of what had just occurred slowly sinking in. A nobleman had kissed his housekeeper, a breach of propriety so profound it could cost her her reputation and her livelihood. Yet all she could think of was the look in Adrian's eyes just before his lips had met hers, a look not of conquest or casual desire, but of a man stepping off a cliff into unknown waters. The question that remained, as she quietly left the West Wing and closed the forbidden door behind her, was whether either of them would survive the fall. The promised dinner never materialized. Adrian sent word through Vasile that urgent business required his attention, and he would not be available that evening. Mara received the message with a calm exterior that belied her inner turmoil. The kiss, impulsive, inappropriate, and undeniably electrifying, had upset the careful balance they had established. By dawn the next morning, Mara was ready to depart. She stood in the courtyard beside Stella, adjusting the saddle straps while Adrian's man, a taciturn fellow named Christian, prepared his own mount nearby. "You travel light," observed a familiar voice behind her. Mara turned to find Adrian approaching, his expression guarded but composed. In the early morning light he looked tired, as though sleep had eluded him as thoroughly as it had her. "I've learned to carry only what's necessary," she replied, her voice admirably steady. Adrian nodded, keeping a careful distance between them. A wise approach for any journey. He handed her a sealed letter. "The caretaker of the townhouse will provide whatever else you require upon your arrival. This should ensure his full cooperation." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Mara felt Adrian tense slightly before withdrawing his hand. "Thank you, my lord," she said formally, tucking the letter into her valise. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Adrian cleared his throat. "About yesterday." "We need not discuss it," Mara interrupted gently. "It was a momentary lapse that's best forgotten." Something flickered in Adrian's eyes. Relief, perhaps, or disappointment. "Yes, of course. Most sensible." He straightened, resuming the mantle of lordship that had briefly slipped. "Safe journey, Miss Dobre. I trust you'll send word when you reach Bucharest." "Of course, my lord." Adrian hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then simply nodded and stepped back. "Christian will see you safely to the city. Follow his guidance regarding the roads. He knows them well." With nothing left to say, Mara mounted Stella with practiced ease, the lessons of her youth returning despite the years away from the saddle. She looked down at Adrian, memorizing the stark lines of his face in the morning light. "I shall return within the fortnight," she said. "The household will be maintained in my absence." Adrian's lips curved in a ghost of a smile. "I'm more concerned with the housekeeper's return than the maintenance of the house." Before Mara could respond to this unexpected admission, he stepped back and signaled to Christian. The man nudged his horse forward, and Mara had no choice but to follow, leaving Adrian standing in the courtyard, a solitary figure once more. The journey to Bucharest proceeded without incident. The route Adrian had chosen proved as safe as promised, and Christian, while not conversational, was attentive and professional in his duties. They reached the outskirts of the capital by late afternoon the following day. The townhouse on Strada Victoriae was a handsome three-story building in a fashionable district, far grander than Mara had anticipated. The elderly caretaker greeted her with a formal bow after reading Adrian's letter, treating her with a deference that made her uncomfortable. "Lord Ionescu instructs that you are to be afforded every courtesy, madam," he explained, showing her to an elegantly appointed bedchamber on the second floor. "The house is at your disposal for as long as required." After Christian departed with Stella, Mara found herself alone in the unfamiliar luxury of Adrian's Bucharest residence. She changed from her travel clothes into a simple but respectable dress she had packed, preparing to seek out the man who had written about her son. The address from the letter led her to a modest tavern near the edge of the city. Inside, Mara found the typical evening crowd of workers and merchants, with a scattering of more prosperous citizens enjoying the renowned local wine. She approached the barkeeper, a heavy-set man with a soldier's bearing despite his civilian clothes. "I'm looking for Mr. Dalka," she said, keeping her voice low. "He sent me a letter regarding a personal matter." The barkeeper's eyes narrowed slightly. "And you are?" "Mara Dobre." Recognition flashed across his features. "Ah, yes. He's expecting you, though not for another week. Follow me." He led her to a private room at the back of the establishment, knocking once before opening the door. Inside, a lean man with graying temples sat at a small table, papers spread before him. He rose quickly when Mara entered. "Miss Dobre," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I hadn't expected you so soon. My letter only went out 2 weeks ago." "When it concerns my son, I don't delay," Mara replied, studying the man carefully. "You're Mr. Dalka?" "Konstantin Dalka, formerly of the Bucharest police, now a private investigator." He returned to his seat, gathering his papers into a neat pile. I was hired 3 months ago by a client who wishes to remain anonymous to look into certain irregular adoptions from the St. Nicholas orphanage between 1838 and 1842. Mara's heart began to race. My patru was taken there after I was told he had died. That was in 1840. Dalka nodded. Yes, the timing aligns. Your name appeared in the orphanage records, which is why I contacted you. He hesitated. Before we continue, I must ask, can you prove your identity? I need to be certain you are indeed the Mara Dobre mentioned in these records. Mara removed a small locket from around her neck, opening it to reveal a tiny portrait of a dark-haired infant. This is the only image I have of my son. On the back is engraved my name and his birth date. Dalka examined the locket carefully, then returned it with a satisfied nod. That matches the information in my records. He drew a deep breath. What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear. Are you prepared? I've lived with uncertainty for 5 years, Mara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Whatever truth you have, I need to know it. Very well. Dalka consulted his notes. According to my investigation, several children from St. Nicholas were not orphans at all, but were taken through deception and placed with wealthy families who paid handsomely for healthy infants. Your son appears to have been one of these children. The room seemed to tilt around Mara. Are you saying my son was stolen? Sold? That appears to be the case, Dalka confirmed grimly. There was an organized operation involving a doctor, a midwife, and at least one administrator at St. Nicholas. They would tell mothers their infants had died, then place the children with families willing to pay substantial sums. Mara's hands clenched into fists on the table. And Petru? Do you know where he is now? Dalka withdrew a folded paper from inside his coat. A boy matching his description was placed with the Antonescu family, their minor nobility with an estate near Brașov. He slid the paper across to her, a crude map with directions marked in red ink. I can't be absolutely certain it's your son without seeing him myself, but the age, coloring, and birthmark on his shoulder that was noted in the records all align. Mara blinked back tears, hope and rage warring within her. How did this happen? How could such evil be allowed? Greed, Dalka said simply, and the desperation of childless wealthy couples willing to overlook the origins of their suddenly acquired orphans. He leaned forward. Miss Dobre, I must warn you. The Antonescu family believes this child to be legitimately theirs. They may not welcome your appearance, and they have connections in high places. I don't care about their connections, Mara said, steel entering her voice. If this is my Petru, nothing will keep me from him. A commotion outside the private room interrupted their conversation. Raised voices carried through the thin door, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Dalka rose quickly, his hand moving instinctively to his belt, where Mara glimpsed the outline of a pistol. Stay here, he instructed, moving cautiously to the door. Before he could reach it, the door burst open, revealing 3 rough-looking men. The leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, surveyed the room with cold calculation. There you are, Dalka, he said, his voice deceptively casual. You've been asking too many questions about matters that don't concern you. Dalka stood his ground. This is a private meeting. Leave now, or I'll have the owner throw you out. The scarred man laughed. The owner is currently unconscious behind his bar. No one will interrupt us. His gaze shifted to Mara, and a slow smile spread across his face. Ah, and this must be the grieving mother. How touching. Fear coursed through Mara, but she refused to show it. Who are you? What do you want? My name is unimportant, the man replied. As for what I want, I'm here to ensure that certain arrangements remain undisturbed. The past should stay buried. Don't you agree? Dalka subtly positioned himself between Mara and the intruders. You're working for the doctor, aren't you? Or is it the orphanage administrator? Smart man, the scarred intruder acknowledged with a nod. Too smart for your own good. He gestured to his companions. Take them both. We'll discuss this somewhere more private. As the men advanced, the door behind them suddenly flew open again, striking one of them squarely in the back and sending him stumbling forward. In the doorway stood a tall figure that Mara recognized with a shock of disbelief. "I believe," said Adrian Ionescu, his voice cold with controlled fury, "that you're interrupting my employees' meeting." The leader turned, clearly annoyed by the new interruption, until he registered Adrian's fine clothing and aristocratic bearing. Uncertainty flickered across his features. "This doesn't concern you, sir. It's a private matter." "On the contrary," Adrian replied, stepping into the room with casual confidence. "It concerns me directly." He glanced at Mara, his expression softening momentarily before hardening again as he turned back to the intruders. "You have precisely 10 seconds to leave before I demonstrate exactly how concerned I am." The scarred man hesitated, weighing his options as he took in Adrian's commanding presence. "You don't know what you're involving yourself in." 9 seconds, Adrian counted calmly. With a muttered curse, the leader motioned to his men. "This isn't finished," he warned, his gaze lingering on Mara before they retreated through the door. As soon as they were gone, Mara rushed to the window to ensure they truly departed. In the street below, she watched the 3 men mount horses and ride away, their postures radiating frustrated anger. "Are you hurt?" Adrian's voice was close behind her, his concern evident. Mara turned to face him. "No, I'm fine. But what are you doing here? How did you find me?" Adrian's lips curved in a slight smile. "Did you think I would send you alone into potential danger?" Christian remained in Bucharest to keep watch. "When he saw you enter this establishment, he sent word to me immediately. You were following me?" Mara wasn't sure whether to be angry or touched. "Protecting you," Adrian corrected, his eyes serious. Which it seems was not unwarranted. Dalka cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "I don't know who you are, sir, but your timing was impeccable." Adrian turned, appraising the investigator with a coolly assessing gaze. "Lord Adrian Ionescu, and you're the man who wrote to Miss Dobry about her son." "Konstantin Dalka, at your service, my lord." The investigator bowed slightly. "Those men were working for someone connected to the illegal adoptions I've been investigating. Their appearance confirms my findings are accurate and dangerous to someone with influence." "Then we have no time to waste," Adrian said decisively. "Miss Dobry, gather your things. We leave for Brasov immediately." Mara stared at him in shock. "We?" Adrian's expression softened slightly. "Did you think I would abandon you now? Whatever lies ahead, you won't face it alone." The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet certainty, sent warmth spreading through Mara's chest. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her burdens lighten, shared by shoulders stronger than her own. Yet as they prepared to depart, Mara couldn't help wondering what had truly brought Adrian to her side. Was it merely concern for a valued employee? Or had that impulsive kiss revealed feelings deeper than either of them was prepared to acknowledge? The carriage rattled along the winding road to Brasov, its steady rhythm occasionally broken by the uneven terrain. Inside, Mara sat across from Adrian, watching the Romanian countryside flow past the window while her thoughts raced ahead to what awaited them. Dalka had remained in Bucharest, promising to continue his investigation into the people behind the adoption scheme. Before parting, he had provided them with additional details about the Antonescu family, their standing in society, the layout of their estate, and most importantly, confirmation that they had a boy of the right age who they claimed as their son. "You're very quiet," Adrian observed, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled between them. Mara turned from the window to meet his gaze. In the dim light of the carriage, his features seemed softer, the habitual sternness giving way to genuine concern. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Not of danger, but of hope. After believing him dead for so long, to suddenly think Petru might be alive." Her voice faltered. "What if we're wrong? Or worse, what if we're right? But he no longer remembers me." Adrian leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "Children remember more than we give them credit for, especially of those who loved them deeply." He hesitated, then added, "How old was he when you were separated?" 3, Mara replied, the memory sharp and painful. "Just old enough to call me Mama and run to me when I entered a room." She smiled faintly at the recollection. He had the most infectious laugh, like little bells ringing. Adrian's eyes softened further. "Tell me about him," he said, his voice gentle. "Who was Petru before you lost him?" The simple request, offered without judgment or pity, loosened something in Mara's chest. Words began to flow, hesitantly at first, then with increasing warmth as she described her son's curious nature, his stubbornness, his delight in simple pleasures like the patterns sunlight made through leaves. "He sounds remarkable," Adrian said when she finally fell silent. "You must have been an extraordinary mother to notice such details." "I tried to be," Mara replied softly, "though circumstances made it difficult." Adrian nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You've never mentioned his father. Was he—" "A nobleman's son," Mara supplied, her tone deliberately even. "Constantine Dragulescu. He was studying in Vienna when we met. I was employed as a companion to his cousin. He spoke of love, of marriage even, until I told him I was with child." Her lips twisted in a bitter smile. "His family quickly arranged a more suitable match for him, and I was dismissed without references." Adrian's jaw tightened. "This Dragulescu, he provided nothing for the child?" "A small settlement, arranged through his father's solicitor, with the condition that I never contact the family again." Mara shrugged. "It was enough to sustain us for a time, until Petru fell ill. And that's when you were told he died?" Mara nodded, the old pain washing over her anew. "The doctor said it was scarlet fever. I wasn't permitted to see his body. They claimed it was for my safety, to prevent contagion." Her hands clenched in her lap. "I should have demanded to see him, should have known something was wrong, but I was so broken by grief." "You couldn't have known," Adrian said firmly. "The deception was deliberate and cruel, designed to exploit your vulnerability." His expression darkened. "When this is over, those responsible will answer for what they've done." The quiet authority in his voice sent a shiver down Mara's spine. She had glimpsed this side of Adrian before, the nobleman accustomed to command, whose will was rarely thwarted. Yet now that power was aligned with her cause, a sword drawn in her defense rather than against her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Helping me, I mean. It's far beyond what any employer would do for a housekeeper." Adrian's gaze dropped to his hands, which flexed slightly against his knees. When he looked up again, something vulnerable flickered behind his usual reserve. "Because I understand what it is to search for someone who might be lost forever," he said quietly. "The difference is, you might actually find your missing piece while mine." He trailed off, shaking his head. "And perhaps also because you've brought something into my home that has been absent for too long." "What's that?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's eyes met hers directly. "Life," he said simply. "Courage. A refusal to surrender to despair." He cleared his throat, as if uncomfortable with such frank admission. "Besides, what nobleman worth his title would allow a lady under his protection to face such challenges alone?" The carriage hit a particularly deep rut, jostling them both. Adrian instinctively reached out to steady Mara, his hand warm against her arm. Neither spoke as the contact lingered seconds longer than necessary, the air between them charged with unacknowledged tension. Adrian withdrew first, settling back against the cushioned seat. "We should arrive by nightfall," he said, his voice resuming its usual composed tone. "I've sent word ahead to secure rooms at an inn. The Antonescu estate lies just outside the town. We'll approach them in the morning." Mara nodded, grateful for his practical focus. "What will we tell them? I can hardly arrive on their doorstep claiming their son is actually mine." "I've considered that," Adrian replied. "The Antonescu family, while respectable, lacks the social standing to refuse a visit from someone of my rank. I'll present myself as interested in purchasing horses. They're known for their breeding program. You'll accompany me as my—" He hesitated, searching for the appropriate term. "Your housekeeper," Mara supplied. Adrian shook his head. "That would seem strange for this context. No, you'll pose as my distant cousin, come to assist in selecting a suitable mount for a lady." A faint smile touched his lips. Your expertise with horses is adequate to maintain the pretense? I grew up around them, Mara confirmed. My father was a stable master before his death. Good. That gives us legitimate reason to visit and observe the household. If the boy is present, you'll have a chance to see him without immediately raising suspicions. The practicality of the plan calmed Mara's racing thoughts. And if I believe it's truly Petru, what then? Adrian's expression grew serious. Then we gather evidence proving the deception. Dalka is already compiling documentation from the orphanage and medical records. With my influence and his evidence, we approach the authorities. He reached across to cover her hand briefly with his own. One step at a time, Mara. First, we must confirm whether this boy is indeed your son. The town of Brasov welcomed them with twinkling lights as dusk settled over the Carpathian foothills. Their inn, the Golden Stag, offered comfortable if modest accommodations, 2 adjoining rooms with a shared sitting area between them. After a simple but satisfying meal eaten privately in this common space, they lingered over glasses of local wine, reviewing their strategy for the morning. The easy collaboration between them felt strangely natural, as if they had been partners in such ventures before, rather than master and servant thrown together by extraordinary circumstances. You should rest, Adrian said finally, noting the fatigue beginning to show in Mara's face. Tomorrow will require all your strength. Mara nodded, rising from her chair. At the door to her bedchamber, she paused, turning back to where Adrian still sat, his profile outlined by the warm glow of the fire. Thank you, she said softly. Not just for the help, but for understanding why this matters so much. Adrian looked up, his expression unusually open. We all have our ghosts, Mara. Yours at least offers the possibility of resurrection. The quiet vulnerability in his voice drew her back a step toward him. And yours? Mine are properly dead and buried, he replied, a hint of the old bitterness returning. Or so I thought until recently. What changed? Mara asked, sensing they were approaching something significant. Adrian studied her face for a long moment before answering. You, he said simply. You reminded me that there might be life beyond loss. The admission hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither seemed ready to fully address. Mara felt her heart quicken as Adrian rose and approached her, stopping just close enough that she could detect the faint scent of sandalwood that always seemed to accompany him. When I thought those men might harm you in Bucharest, he said, his voice low, I experienced a fear unlike anything I've known in years. Not since Elisabetta disappeared have I. He shook his head, struggling with words that didn't come easily to him. It made me realize that I've come to care what happens to you, Mara Dobre, far more than is wise or appropriate. Mara felt the heat rise to her cheeks. My lord. Adrian, he corrected gently. After all we've shared, I think formality between us has become somewhat absurd, don't you? Despite her racing heart, Mara found herself smiling. Adrian, then. But whatever this is between us, it doesn't change who we are in the eyes of the world. You're still a nobleman, and I'm still a remarkable woman who has endured more than most could bear without losing her compassion or courage. He interrupted, his gaze intense. Titles and positions mean little against that reality. Before she could formulate a response, Adrian took her hand in his, raising it slowly to his lips. Unlike the courtly kisses bestowed as social custom, this was deliberate and lingering, his eyes holding hers with unmistakable intent. Whatever comes tomorrow, he said softly as he lowered her hand but didn't release it, know that you do not face it alone. Not anymore. The moment stretched between them, taut with possibility. Then, with a gentleness that belied his usual commanding presence, Adrian drew her closer, his free hand rising to cup her cheek. This kiss was unlike their first, not impulsive or brief, but deliberate and deep, an exploration rather than a claim. Mara's hands found their way to his shoulders, steadying herself against the sensation of falling even while standing still. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Adrian rested his forehead against hers for a moment. His eyes closed as if committing the moment to memory. We should sleep, he murmured, though he made no move to step away. Tomorrow. Tomorrow, Mara agreed softly, understanding all that the word encompassed. The search for her son, the complications of their evolving relationship, the uncertain future that awaited them both. Adrian finally stepped back, though his reluctance was evident in every line of his body. "Good night, Mara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Dream of hope." As she closed the door to her chamber moments later, Mara pressed her fingers to her lips, still warm from his kiss. For the first time in years, hope didn't feel like a dangerous indulgence, but a possibility as real and substantial as the man who had awakened it within her. Morning arrived with pale winter sunlight filtering through the frost-etched windows of the Golden Stag. Mara had risen before dawn, her nerves making sleep impossible as the momentous day ahead loomed. She stood before the small looking glass, smoothing the borrowed gown Adrian had somehow procured, a deep burgundy creation of fine wool and velvet trim that transformed her appearance from servant to gentlewoman. A soft knock at her door announced Adrian's presence. When she opened it, she found him impeccably dressed in a dark riding coat, his hair neatly combed back, emphasizing the strong lines of his face. "You look," he began, then paused, his eyes traveling appreciatively over her transformed appearance. "Entirely convincing as my cousin," he finished, though his expression suggested he'd considered other descriptions. "Will I pass scrutiny among the nobility?" Mara asked, smoothing the unfamiliar fabric nervously. Adrian's smile was warm. "You would grace any drawing room in Romania. The gown merely enhances what was already there." A blush heated Mara's cheeks at the compliment. Last night's kiss hung between them, acknowledged in their eyes but tactfully unmentioned as they focused on the task ahead. "Our carriage awaits," Adrian said, offering his arm with formal courtesy. "Are you ready?" Mara placed her hand on his sleeve, drawing strength from his solid presence. "As ready as I can be." The Antonescu estate lay 7 miles outside Brașov, a prosperous property comprised of rolling pastures and a handsome manor house built in the previous century. As their carriage approached through the avenue of bare-branched lindens, Mara fought to control her racing heart. "Remember," Adrian murmured as they neared the entrance, "we are here to view horses. Nothing more. Observe carefully, but reveal nothing of our true purpose." Mara nodded, grateful for his steady guidance as a footman helped her descend from the carriage. Their reception was precisely as Adrian had predicted. The Antonescu family, represented by Victor Antonescu, a corpulent man in his 50s, and his much younger wife, Elena, were visibly flattered by the unexpected visit from a nobleman of Adrian's standing. "Lord Ionescu, what an honor!" Victor exclaimed, bowing deeply in the entrance hall. "Had we known you were coming, we would have prepared a proper welcome." "The fault is entirely mine for arriving unannounced," Adrian replied with perfect aristocratic ease. "I find myself in need of several new horses, and your reputation as a breeder has reached even my remote corner of the country." Elena Antonescu, a delicate blonde woman no older than 30, curtsied gracefully. "Your timing is fortunate, my lord. Victor has just acquired a magnificent Andalusian stallion that would suit your stables perfectly." Adrian introduced Mara as his cousin, recently returned from Vienna, and in need of a suitable mount for the coming spring. The Antonescus accepted the introduction without suspicion, though Elena's eyes lingered curiously on Mara's face. "You must join us for luncheon after viewing the stables," Victor insisted. "It's rare we have visitors of such distinction, especially in these winter months." The invitation was exactly what they had hoped for. Adrian accepted with just the right amount of gracious condescension, and they were soon being led toward the stables where Victor proudly displayed his collection of horses. Throughout the tour, Mara maintained her role perfectly, commenting knowledgeably on the animal's conformation and bloodlines, while her eyes darted constantly to the house and grounds, searching for any sign of a child. Adrian skillfully drew Victor into detailed discussions of breeding and prices, creating opportunities for Mara to wander slightly apart, extending her range of observation. It was during one such moment, as they moved from the stables to the training paddock, that Mara spotted him. A small figure bundled against the winter chill, watching the proceedings from the shelter of a nearby outbuilding. Even at this distance, something in the child's posture, the particular tilt of his head as he observed the adults, sent a shock of recognition through her. Adrian, alert to her every reaction, noticed her sudden stillness. Without interrupting his conversation with Victor, he subtly maneuvered their group in the direction of the child. As they drew nearer, Mara fought to maintain her composure. The boy appeared to be about 8 years old, with dark curls peeking from beneath his woolen cap and serious eyes that studied the visitors with undisguised curiosity. When Victor noticed his presence, he beckoned the child forward with a proprietorial gesture. "Ah, Nikolai! Come meet our distinguished guests." The name, not Petru, struck Mara like a physical blow, though she kept her expression carefully neutral as the boy approached. "My son," Victor said proudly, placing a hand on the child's shoulder. "The future master of this estate. A fine-looking boy." Adrian commented smoothly. "He has your bearing, sir." Victor beamed at the compliment while the child remained solemn, his dark eyes moving between the visitors with intelligent assessment. "Your cousin might appreciate seeing Nikolai's pony," Victor suggested to Adrian. "A gentle creature, perfect for a lady's first mount." The suggestion gave Mara the opportunity she desperately needed. As the men continued their discussion of bloodlines and prices, she followed the boy to a smaller paddock where a dappled gray pony grazed contentedly. "His name is Fulgur," the child said, his voice clear and confident as he approached the pony. "It means lightning, but he's not really very fast." "He's beautiful," Mara replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Do you ride him often?" The boy nodded, reaching up to stroke the pony's nose. "Every day, when Mother allows it. Father says I'll have a proper horse when I turn 10. As he turned slightly to demonstrate how he mounted the pony, Mara caught sight of a small birthmark just below his ear, a crescent-shaped mark identical to the one her Petru had carried since birth. The blood rushed in her ears, and she gripped the paddock fence to steady herself. "Are you unwell, madam?" the child asked, his brow furrowing in concern. The expression, so familiar, so heartbreakingly like her own father's, confirmed what she already knew in her heart. This was her son, alive and well and standing before her, utterly unaware of who she was. "Just a momentary dizziness," Mara managed. "It's past now." The boy studied her face with uncommon intensity. "You seem familiar," he said suddenly. "Have we met before?" The innocent question nearly undid her composure. "I don't believe so," she replied softly. "I would remember such a meeting." "Nikolai," Elena's voice called from the direction of the house. "Time for your lessons." The boy sighed dramatically. "I must go. My tutor becomes cross if I'm late." He bowed with childish formality. "It was a pleasure to meet you, madam." "The pleasure was mine," Mara whispered, watching as her son, now called Nikolai, ran toward the house, taking her heart with him. She remained by the paddock, gathering her composure until Adrian appeared at her side. His expression told her he had observed the exchange and understood its significance. "It's him," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "My Petru. There's a birthmark below his left ear, just like—" She trailed off, unable to continue. Adrian's hand found hers, hidden from view by the paddock fence. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I am of my own name," Mara replied. "He even said I seemed familiar. After 5 years, some part of him still recognizes me." Adrian squeezed her hand gently. "Then we've confirmed what we came to learn. Now we must proceed carefully. The Antonescus have invited us to luncheon, an opportunity to observe the household further." The meal was an exquisite torture for Mara. Seated across from the boy, her son, her Petru, she struggled to maintain her role while her heart screamed to claim him. The child ate with careful manners, speaking only when addressed directly, his serious demeanor occasionally broken by flashes of a bright, curious intelligence that Mara recognized with painful clarity. Elena proved to be an attentive, if somewhat distant mother, correcting the boy's posture or speech with gentle reminders. Victor clearly viewed his son as an asset, an heir to continue the Antonescu name and inheritance. Neither seemed deliberately cruel, but there was no mistaking the formal nature of their relationships. This was not a family bound by deep affection, but by convention and duty. As the meal concluded, Victor proposed showing Adrian his collection of hunting rifles, leaving Mara in the drawing room with Elena. The opportunity for information was too perfect to waste. "Your son is remarkably well-mannered," Mara commented, accepting a cup of tea from a hovering servant. "You must be very proud." Elena's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Nikolai is our blessing. For years the doctor said I could never bear children." She glanced toward the door where the boy had exited. "When he came to us, it was like a miracle." "Came to you?" Mara echoed carefully. A shadow crossed Elena's face. "I meant when he was born, of course," she corrected hastily, "though sometimes it feels as though he was delivered to us by providence rather than conventional means." Mara's heart raced at this near admission. "Children are indeed gifts, however they arrive in our lives," she said, choosing her words with extreme care. "Have you and your husband considered expanding your family further?" "Victor would like more children," Elena replied, a certain tension entering her voice, but the same condition that made Nikolai's arrival so unexpected prevents it. She set down her teacup with a faint clink. "Forgive me, but I find this topic somewhat difficult. Shall we discuss something else?" Before Mara could respond, the drawing room door opened to admit Adrian and Victor, the latter flushed with pleasure at having shown off his prized possessions to such a distinguished guest. "Lord Ionescu has made a most generous offer for the Andalusian and 2 mares," Victor announced. "We shall conclude the sale immediately." Adrian caught Mara's eye briefly. "My cousin's counsel has been invaluable in this decision. Her eye for horseflesh is exceptional. The unexpected purchase gave them a perfect reason to return to the Antonescu estate in the coming days, to finalize paperwork and arrange transportation of the horses." As they took their leave an hour later, Mara caught a final glimpse of her son watching from an upstairs window, his small hand raised in a solemn farewell. The carriage ride back to Brasov passed in tense silence until they were well beyond the Antonescu property. Only then did Adrian speak. "I saw your face when you spoke with the boy. He is your son, isn't he?" "Without question," Mara confirmed, tears finally spilling down her cheeks now that she could release her tightly held composure. Elena all but admitted he wasn't born to them. She spoke of him coming to them as a miracle after being told she couldn't bear children. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Then we have what we came for, confirmation. Now we need proof that can't be dismissed or overlooked." He reached across to clasp her hand. "Dalka should arrive tomorrow with the documents from Bucharest. Once we have those, we can approach the authorities." Mara stared out at the passing landscape, her emotions in turmoil. "They aren't cruel to him," she said quietly. "The Antonescus. They've given him advantages I never could. Education, security, a future among the gentry." "Are you having second thoughts?" Adrian asked, studying her face. Mara shook her head firmly. "No. He is my son, my flesh and blood. Nothing can change that." She turned to Adrian, her expression resolute through her tears. "But I won't destroy his life to reclaim him. Whatever happens next must consider his happiness above all else." Adrian nodded, a new respect dawning in his eyes. "Your love for him is evident in that decision alone." He squeezed her hand gently. "We will find a path forward that honors both your rights as his mother and his well-being." As the carriage approached Brasov, Mara felt a complex mixture of emotions: joy at finding her son alive and well, determination to reclaim him, and fear of the battle that surely lay ahead. Yet alongside these swirled something else, something unexpected: gratitude for the man seated across from her, whose strength and support had made this moment possible. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone. Their return to the Golden Stag Inn was met with an unexpected commotion. A sleek black carriage bearing a familiar crest stood in the courtyard, its matching pair of stallions still being tended to by stable hands. Adrian's expression darkened as he recognized the emblem. "Elisabetta," he murmured, his voice tight with disbelief. "Your wife?" Mara asked, her heart sinking with a cold dread that surprised her in its intensity. Adrian nodded once, his face now a rigid mask. It appears the past has chosen this moment to resurrect itself. They entered the inn to find the main parlor commandeered by a striking woman in her late 30s. Elegant from her perfectly coiffed dark hair to her fashionable Parisian boots, Elisabeta Ionescu cut a commanding figure even while seated. She rose at their entrance, her painted lips curving into a practiced smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "Adrian, my dear husband, what a journey I've had trying to find you." Her gaze slid to Mara, assessing her from head to toe in a single sweep. And who might this be? Adrian's posture was rigid, his voice controlled but cold. "Elisabeta, this is unexpected after 7 years of silence." "Circumstances change," she replied smoothly, stepping forward to place a proprietary hand on his arm. "Won't you introduce me to your companion?" "This is Miss Mara Dobre," Adrian said stiffly. "She is in my employ." Elisabeta's perfectly arched eyebrows rose. "You travel with your servants now? How democratic of you." She turned to Mara with a dismissive smile. "You may leave us. My husband and I have private matters to discuss." Before Mara could respond, Adrian intervened. "Miss Dobre stays. She is involved in a matter of some importance that requires my attention." A flash of annoyance crossed Elisabeta's refined features. "More important than your wife's return?" "Former wife, by all practical measures," Adrian corrected coldly. "You surrendered any claim to that title when you disappeared without explanation." Elisabeta sighed dramatically. "Always so harsh, Adrian. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private." Her gaze pointedly excluded Mara. The tension in the room was palpable. Mara took a step back, acutely aware of her awkward position. "My lord, I can retire to my room if you wish to speak privately." Adrian turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "That won't be necessary." "Actually, it would be most appreciated," Elisabeta interrupted smoothly. "Servants' presence does inhibit frank conversation." Adrian's jaw tightened at the deliberate slight, but Mara shook her head subtly. This confrontation was inevitable, and her presence would only complicate matters. "I'll check if there's any word from Mr. Dalka," she said quietly. "Please excuse me." As she left the parlor, she felt Elisabeta's triumphant gaze following her. The weight of the woman's presence, beautiful, sophisticated, and sharing a history with Adrian that Mara could never match, settled on her shoulders like a physical burden. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Mara remained in her room, alternately pacing and seated by the window, watching the street below where occasional passers-by hurried through the winter afternoon. Her thoughts swung between concern for her son's situation and uncertainty about what Elisabeta's return might mean for whatever had been developing between her and Adrian. A soft knock at her door startled her from her reverie. She opened it to find Adrian standing there, his expression weary but composed. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice low. Mara stepped back, allowing him to enter. "Of course. Is everything resolved?" Adrian moved to the window, gazing out at the darkening sky. "Hardly. Elisabeta has a remarkable talent for complicating what was already complex." He turned to face Mara. "She claims she's returned to reclaim her position as my wife." Mara's heart constricted painfully. "I see. Do you?" Adrian asked, his eyes searching hers. "Because I'm not certain I do. After 7 years of silence, she appears precisely when I've begun to—" He trailed off, then continued in a harder tone. "Her timing is suspiciously convenient." "What does she want?" Mara asked, trying to focus on practicalities rather than the emotions churning inside her. "Ostensibly reconciliation. In reality?" Adrian's laugh was short and bitter. "Security. Her lover, a Viennese count with more charm than fortune, apparently tired of her. Now she finds herself without protection or adequate funds. And she expects you to welcome her back after all this time? She expects my name, my wealth, and my position to shield her from the consequences of her choices." Adrian's expression hardened. She made quite clear that she has no intention of being a true wife, merely of maintaining the public appearance of one. "And what did you tell her?" Mara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Adrian crossed the room to stand before her. That I needed time to consider the situation, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. It was not the answer I wished to give, but with everything else at stake, your son, the investigation, I thought it prudent to avoid an immediate confrontation. Relief washed through Mara, followed quickly by guilt at her selfishness. She is still legally your wife, she said quietly. Society would expect you to take her back. Society, Adrian replied with undisguised contempt, has no say in what happens within the walls of my home or the chambers of my heart. His voice softened as he took her hands in his. Mara, whatever lies between us, and I believe we both know there is something, it deserves more consideration than Elisabetta's convenient reappearance. Before Mara could respond, another knock sounded at the door. Adrian released her hands reluctantly and stepped back as she moved to answer it. A young messenger boy stood in the hallway, cap in hand. Message for Lord Ionescu, he announced. The innkeeper said I'd find him here. Adrian approached, accepting the folded note. Who sent this? A gentleman just arrived in town, my lord. Said it was urgent. Adrian unfolded the paper, his expression sharpening as he read. It's from Dalka. He's arrived with the documentation and wishes to meet immediately. He pressed a coin into the boy's hand. Tell him we'll join him within the hour. As the messenger departed, Adrian turned back to Mara. This could be the evidence we need. Are you ready? Mara nodded, grateful for the return to the matter that had brought them to Brasov. What about Elisabetta? She's resting in her rooms. We'll be back before she notices our absence. Adrian's lips curved in a grim smile. Besides, her opinion on my activities ceased to matter the day she walked out of my life. They slipped out of the inn through a side entrance, making their way through Brasov's winding streets to a modest coffee house where Dalka awaited them. The investigator rose as they entered, his expression betraying both excitement and concern. I have everything, he said without preamble once they were seated in a private corner. Medical records from the doctor who pronounced your son dead. Financial transfers from the Antonescu family to the orphanage, even sworn testimony from a former nursemaid who witnessed several such adoptions. He spread the documents before them on the small table. Mara's hands trembled as she read the medical certificate declaring her 3-year-old son deceased from scarlet fever, signed by a doctor who had received a substantial payment from St. Nicholas Orphanage the very next day. This is enough to approach the authorities, Adrian said, scanning the papers with a practiced eye. The evidence of fraud is irrefutable. Dalka nodded, but his expression remained troubled. There's a complication. The Antonescu family has connections to the regional magistrate, a cousin by marriage, and there's more. He withdrew another document from his coat. This arrived at my office in Bucharest just before I departed. It's a letter warning me to abandon the investigation, signed by a very high-ranking official in the Interior Ministry. They're protecting the scandal from reaching beyond the orphanage, Adrian deduced. Too many prominent families might be implicated if the full scope of these adoptions came to light. Mara stared at the documents, dismay washing over her. Are you saying that even with this evidence we might not succeed? I'm saying we need to be strategic, Dalka replied. A direct legal challenge might be blocked by powerful interests. But there are other approaches. He turned to Adrian. Your social standing could be invaluable here, my lord. The Antonescus would be reluctant to oppose you directly. Adrian nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. A private negotiation, perhaps. Approach them with the evidence, but offer terms that allow them to save face. What terms? Mara asked, unable to imagine any compromise that would restore her son to her. Shared custody initially, Adrian suggested carefully. The boy, Nikolai as they've named him, has known them as parents for 5 years. An abrupt separation could be traumatic for him. Though the suggestion pained her, Mara recognized the wisdom in it. His well-being must come first, she agreed reluctantly. But I won't be denied my place in his life any longer. Then we approach them tomorrow, Adrian decided. Present the evidence privately and propose a resolution that considers the child's interests while acknowledging the deception. Their discussion of strategy continued as darkness fell outside, the coffee house gradually emptying around them. Finally, Dalka gathered the documents, promising to have formal copies prepared for their meeting with the Antonescus. There's one more thing you should know, he said as they prepared to leave. The men who confronted us in Bucharest have been asking about you in town. They know you're here. Adrian's expression hardened. Then we must move quickly. Tomorrow morning, first thing. As they stepped into the street, the winter air bit at their faces. Mara pulled her cloak tighter, her mind racing with the implications of all they had learned. What if the Antonescus refused to cooperate, even with the evidence? Then we pursue legal channels, regardless of their connections. Adrian replied firmly. I have my own influence to wield. He glanced at her, his expression softening. One way or another, Mara, your son will know his true mother. The walk back to the inn seemed shorter, purpose and determination lending speed to their steps. Yet as they approached the building, Mara sensed a shift in Adrian's demeanor, a return of the tension that had marked him since Elisabetta's arrival. I need to tell you something, he said, pausing in the shadows of the courtyard, about Elisabetta and my marriage. Mara waited, her heart beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs. It was never a love match, Adrian continued, his voice low. A union of two old families, arranged to strengthen both. I respected her, admired her even, but love? He shook his head. I believed it might grow in time, but Elisabetta had other ideas. She found provincial Romanian society stifling after Vienna's sophistication. Yet you searched for her when she disappeared, Mara said, remembering the letters she had glimpsed. I searched because she was my responsibility. My honor demanded it. Adrian's eyes found hers in the darkness. But now, faced with her return, I realized that the man who wrote those letters no longer exists. He died during those years of bitterness and isolation, and someone else has taken his place. Who? Mara whispered. Adrian's hand rose to touch her cheek, his fingers warm against her cold skin. Someone who has learned, through your example, that true strength lies not in isolation but in the courage to reach toward another heart. His voice dropped lower. Someone who finds himself falling in love when he least expected it. The word, love, hung in the air between them, startling in its simplicity and profound in its implications. Mara felt tears sting her eyes, confusion and joy warring within her. Adrian, your wife has returned, she said, her voice catching. Whatever lies between us, that reality cannot be ignored. Nor shall it be, he replied firmly. But neither will I ignore this. He drew her into his arms with gentle insistence, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of promise and determination. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Adrian held her gaze intently. First, we secure your son's future. Then, I shall address my own. That is my vow to you, Mara Dobre. As they entered the inn, neither noticed the elegant silhouette watching from an upstairs window, her face hardened with calculation and displeasure at the scene she had witnessed below. The morning dawned clear and cold, a pale winter sun casting long shadows across Brasov's cobbled streets. Mara stood at her window, watching the town come to life below as she steeled herself for the confrontation ahead. Today, after 5 years of grief and uncertainty, she would take the first definitive steps toward reclaiming her son. A soft knock preceded Adrian's entry. He was formally dressed, his bearing reflecting the gravity of their mission. Dalka awaits us downstairs with the documents, he said. The carriage is prepared. And Elisabetta? Mara asked, unable to keep the tension from her voice. Still abed, according to the innkeeper. Adrian's expression betrayed little, though the tight set of his jaw spoke of controlled anger. She made quite clear last night that early rising was beneath her dignity. Their eyes met in silent understanding. Whatever complications Elisabetta's return had introduced, they would not deter them from today's purpose. The journey to the Antonescu estate passed in tense silence, each lost in private thoughts. Dalka occasionally reviewed key points in the documents, but otherwise respected their contemplative mood. It was only as the manor came into view that Adrian reached across to take Mara's hand. Remember, he said quietly, we approach this first as a negotiation, not an accusation. The boy's welfare must remain paramount. Mara nodded, drawing strength from his touch. I understand, though every instinct screams to simply claim him. Patience, Adrian counseled. We hold the stronger position. They cannot dispute the evidence, and my social standing ensures they must at least hear us out. Their arrival caused visible consternation among the household staff, who had not expected visitors so early. Victor Antonescu emerged from his study, his face flushed with surprise at finding Lord Ionescu on his doorstep for the second time in as many days. "My lord, what an unexpected pleasure. Had I known you were coming." "This is not a social call, Mr. Antonescu," Adrian interrupted, his tone coolly authoritative. "I require a private audience with you and your wife on a matter of grave importance." Victor's jovial expression faltered at Adrian's formality. Of course. Elena is in the morning room. Please follow me." Elena Antonescu's reaction to their arrival was more measured than her husband's, her porcelain features betraying only the mildest surprise as they entered the sunlit room where she sat with her embroidery. "Lord Ionescu, how unexpected," she said, setting aside her work and rising gracefully. Her gaze lingered on Mara with more curiosity than the previous day. "Miss Dobre, isn't it? And I don't believe I know your other companion." "Konstantin Dalka," Adrian replied, "a legal representative assisting us with a sensitive matter that concerns your household directly." A flicker of unease crossed Elena's face. "Victor, perhaps you should send for refreshments while our guests explain their business." "That won't be necessary," Adrian said, his tone brooking no argument. "What we have to discuss is best addressed directly and without delay." Once they were seated, Adrian gestured to Dalka, who opened his portfolio and placed several documents on the table between them. "Mr. and Mrs. Antonescu," Adrian began, "it has come to our attention that the child you claim as your son, Nikolai, was acquired through irregular and illegal means from St. Nicholas Orphanage in Bucharest 5 years ago." Victor's face drained of color, while Elena maintained her composure, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped the arms of her chair. That's preposterous," Victor spluttered. "Nikolai is our son, born to us after years of—" "Please," Adrian interrupted, "spare us the fabrication. We have documented evidence of payments made to the orphanage, medical records falsified to declare the child deceased, and testimony from former staff involved in the arrangement." He gestured to the papers, which Victor made no move to examine. Elena, however, leaned forward, her eyes scanning the documents with growing dismay. "Furthermore," Adrian continued relentlessly, "we have the child's true mother present, Miss Mara Dobre, who was falsely told her son had died of scarlet fever when in fact he was taken to the orphanage and subsequently sold to you." At this, Elena's gaze snapped to Mara's face, her expression shifting from shock to a strange, almost sympathetic recognition. "You," she whispered, "you're why he sometimes cries out in his sleep for a woman with chestnut hair." Her voice faltered. "I always wondered why he did that, when my hair is so fair." Victor rose abruptly, his face mottled with anger and fear. "This is outrageous. I'll have you removed from my property immediately." Adrian remained seated, his calm in stark contrast to Victor's agitation. "I wouldn't advise that course of action, Mr. Antonescu. These documents are copies. The originals are secured with my solicitor, with instructions to deliver them to the royal prosecutor should any harm come to us." His voice hardened. "Child trafficking carries severe penalties, as I'm sure you're aware." The threat landed like a physical blow. Victor collapsed back into his chair, his bluster evaporating. "What do you want?" he asked hoarsely. "Money? Is that it?" "We want the boy," Mara said, speaking for the first time, her voice steady despite the emotion churning within her. "My son, whom you've called Nikolai, but whose true name is Petru." "Impossible," Victor declared, though with less conviction than before. "He is our heir, our only child." "A child obtained through fraud and deception," Dalka interjected, tapping the documents meaningfully. "The courts would not look favorably upon such circumstances, regardless of your connections." A heavy silence fell over the room. Then, to everyone's surprise, Elena spoke. "May I speak privately with Miss Dobre?" she asked, her voice composed despite the slight tremor in her hands. Woman to woman, mother to mother. Adrian exchanged a glance with Mara, who nodded her assent. We'll wait in the hall, he agreed, rising with Dalka. But we remain within calling distance. Once the men had withdrawn, Elena moved to sit closer to Mara, her eyes searching the other woman's face intently. You truly are his mother? She asked softly. I am, Mara confirmed. I carried him beneath my heart for 9 months, and raised him for 3 years before he was taken from me through a cruel deception. Elena's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know, she whispered. When they brought him to us from the orphanage, they said he was truly orphaned, that his mother had died in childbirth and his father was unknown. She twisted her hands in her lap. I had lost 3 infants before birth. The doctors said I would never carry a child to term. Nikolai, Petru, was my miracle, my only chance at motherhood. The raw pain in the woman's voice touched Mara unexpectedly. You've cared for him well, she acknowledged. He appears healthy and well-educated. I have loved him as my own, Elena said fiercely. Every day for 5 years. Does that count for nothing? It counts for much, Mara replied quietly. Which is why I haven't simply denounced you to the authorities and demanded his immediate return. Elena studied her with newfound respect. What do you propose then? A transition, Mara said, the word painful despite its reasonableness. He knows you as his parents. To suddenly remove him from everything familiar would be traumatic for him. She drew a deep breath. I propose shared custody, at least initially. He would gradually come to know me as his birth mother while maintaining his relationship with you. Elena's eyes widened in surprise. You would allow us to remain in his life? Even knowing how he came to us? For his sake, yes, Mara confirmed. My son's well-being must come before my own desires or sense of justice. Tears spilled down Elena's cheeks. Victor will resist. He sees the boy as his heir, his legacy. Then help me convince him, Mara urged. The alternative is a public legal battle that would destroy your family's reputation and possibly result in criminal charges. Her voice softened. I do not wish that outcome, especially for the boy's sake. Elena rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens, where, coincidentally, Nikolai was visible playing with a wooden hoop under the supervision of a tutor. He deserves to know the truth of his origins, she said after a long moment. All children do. She turned back to face Mara. But he also deserves the security and advantages we can provide. I agree, Mara said, hope rising within her. Together we might give him the best of both worlds, a mother's love twice over, and a future secured by the Antonescu name and resources. A tentative understanding formed between the two women as they discussed practical arrangements, visits, gradual introductions, how to explain the situation to a child of 8 in terms he could comprehend. By the time they summoned the men back into the room, they had crafted a proposal that, while imperfect, prioritized the boy's welfare above all else. Victor, predictably, resisted initially. This is absurd. The boy is an Antonescu. The boy is Petru Dobre by birth, Adrian countered firmly. And this arrangement is far more generous than you deserve, given the criminal nature of his acquisition. If we refuse, Victor challenged, though his bluster had diminished considerably. Then we proceed through legal channels, Dalka replied smoothly, with evidence of fraud, child trafficking, and falsification of medical records. He paused meaningfully. Such a scandal would be unfortunate for a family of your standing. Victor's face contorted with suppressed rage, but Elena placed a restraining hand on his arm. Husband, she said quietly, think of Nikolai, of what is best for him. You would surrender our son to these people? He demanded incredulously. I would spare him the trauma of a public battle and the sudden loss of the only home he remembers, she replied with unexpected firmness. And he would remain part of our family, with all the privileges that entails. The negotiation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Victor gradually yielding ground as the reality of their situation became inescapable. Finally, a preliminary agreement was reached. Petru would remain with the Antonescus for the present, while Mara would be introduced as a family friend. Over the following months, the truth would be gradually revealed to the boy, and he would begin spending time with his birth mother. The legal arrangements would be formalized through Adrian's solicitors, ensuring both families' rights were protected. As they prepared to depart, Elena drew Mara aside one final time. "He has your eyes," she said softly. "I always wondered where he got that particular shade of hazel. Now I know." She hesitated, then added with painful honesty, "I will not pretend this is easy, but I believe we are doing what is right for him." "Thank you," Mara replied, emotion making her voice rough, "for loving him when I could not be there." The carriage ride back to Brasov passed in contemplative silence, the weight of the morning's events settling over them. Only when the town came into view did Adrian speak. "You were remarkable," he said softly. "Many in your position would have demanded immediate and complete restoration of their rights." "I want my son," Mara replied, "but not at the cost of his happiness. He deserves a gentle transition, not another traumatic upheaval." Adrian's eyes warmed with admiration. "Your compassion extends even to those who wronged you. That is rare, Mara." She shook her head slightly. "Elena was as much a victim of deception as I was in her way. She truly believed she was giving an orphaned child a home." Mara glanced at Dalka, who was tactfully absorbed in his notes. "It is those who orchestrated this scheme who deserve punishment, the doctor, the orphanage officials who profited from our pain. They will face justice," Adrian promised. "Dalka's investigation continues, and I have connections in Bucharest who will ensure the matter isn't swept aside." As they approached the inn, however, Adrian's expression darkened. "And now we must face another battle, of a more personal nature." Elisabetta's carriage still stood in the courtyard, a silent reminder of the complications awaiting them. Mara felt a flutter of apprehension, but also a surprising resolve. After facing down the Antonescus and securing a path to reclaiming her son, confronting Adrian's estranged wife seemed somehow less daunting. "Whatever comes," she said quietly, "today has brought me closer to my son. Nothing can diminish that victory." Adrian's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "One battle at a time, then," he agreed. "And this one, at least, we have won." The news awaiting them at the Golden Stag eclipsed even the emotional triumph of the morning. As they entered the inn's main hall, the proprietor hurried forward, his face creased with concern. "Lord Ionescu, thank goodness you've returned. There's been an incident." "What incident?" Adrian demanded, instantly alert. "Speak plainly, man." The innkeeper wrung his hands nervously. "Your wife, my lord. She departed in great haste not 2 hours ago, taking all her belongings. But before leaving, she—" He hesitated, glancing uncomfortably at Mara. "Go on," Adrian prompted, his voice hardening. "She was overheard telling her driver to make haste to Ionescu Manor. She said something about securing her position before you returned." The innkeeper lowered his voice. "And she was most indiscreet in her comments about Miss Dobray's relationship with you, my lord." Mara felt heat rise to her cheeks, while Adrian's expression darkened ominously. "I see," he said after a moment. "Thank you for the information." He turned to Dalka, who had remained tactfully silent. "Our business in Brasov is concluded for now. We must return to the manor immediately." Within the hour they were on the road, having hastily packed their belongings and settled their account at the inn. The return journey would take at least 2 days. Plenty of time for Elisabetta to reach Ionescu Manor ahead of them and create whatever mischief she intended. "What do you think she plans?" Mara asked, as their carriage rolled through the gathering dusk of the first day's travel. Adrian's face was grim. "Elisabetta has always been skilled at manipulating appearances to her advantage. If she's returning to the manor, it's to establish herself as the mistress of the house before I can prevent it." His jaw tightened. "And given her comments about you, I suspect she means to spread compromising rumors about our association." The delicate phrasing didn't disguise the reality. Elisabetta intended to paint Mara as Adrian's mistress, destroying her reputation and compromising her position in the household. "I have a secure position with the Antonescus now," Mara said quietly. "Perhaps it would be best if I didn't return to Ionescu Manor at all." Adrian turned to her sharply. "Is that truly what you want?" Mara looked away, unable to meet his intense gaze. What I want and what is prudent may be different things. Your wife has returned. A wife who abandoned me without a word, who now returns only because her other options have expired. Adrian interrupted, his voice low but fierce. Do not grant her more authority than she deserves simply because society recognizes a legal bond that she herself has dishonored. The law states that after 7 years' absence, she could be declared dead and our marriage dissolved, Adrian countered. We are mere months from that milestone. He reached across to take her hand. Mara, do not let Elisabetta's machinations separate us. That is precisely her aim. The warmth of his touch and the determination in his voice steadied her. What will you do when we reach the manor? First, I will establish the truth of the situation with the household, Adrian replied. Then I will make my position regarding Elisabetta abundantly clear. His expression softened slightly. And finally, I will ensure your place in the household is secure, respected, and beyond challenge. They reached Ionescu Manor late on the second day, the windows of the grand house gleaming with light against the winter darkness. As their carriage approached, Mara felt a mounting apprehension. What reception awaited them? Had Elisabetta already poisoned the household against her? Vasile met them at the door, his usually impassive face betraying subtle signs of distress. My lord, welcome home. The Lady Ionescu arrived yesterday. She has installed herself in the mistress's chambers. Adrian's expression hardened. Has she indeed? And the staff? Are confused, my lord. It has been many years, and her manner of departure was irregular. Yet she is still legally your wife. The elderly butler hesitated. She has already begun issuing directives regarding household management. I imagine she has, Adrian replied dryly. Please inform Lady Ionescu that I request her presence in my study immediately. He glanced at Mara. Miss Dobre will rest after our journey. Ensure she is not disturbed. As Mara moved toward the servants' staircase, Adrian caught her arm gently. Use your regular chambers, he said quietly. Do not allow yourself to be diminished in this house. She nodded gratefully and headed upstairs, conscious of the curious glances from servants who had clearly heard whatever tale Elisabetta had spun. In her room, Mara found evidence of attempted interference. Some personal items rearranged, her desk disturbed, but nothing was missing or damaged. She was washing away the dust of travel when a soft knock sounded at her door. It was Anna, one of the younger maids who had always been kindly disposed toward Mara. Miss Dobre, she whispered urgently, I thought you should know. The mistress has been saying terrible things about you to the staff, claiming you bewitched the master while she was away, that you're trying to usurp her position. The girl fidgeted nervously. Most don't believe it, especially those who've been here longest, but some of the newer staff are unsure. Thank you for telling me, Anna, Mara replied, touched by the girl's loyalty. It's important to know where one stands. There's more, Anna continued, lowering her voice further. She received a visitor this morning, a rough-looking man with a scar across his eyebrow. They spoke privately, but Miklos the stable boy overheard them mentioning Brashov and a child. Mara's blood ran cold. The description matched the leader of the men who had threatened them in Bucharest. Somehow, Elisabetta had made contact with the very people trying to keep Petru's true parentage hidden. Where is this man now? She asked urgently. Gone, miss. Rode out right after their meeting. Anna's eyes widened at Mara's evident distress. Is something wrong? Possibly, Mara replied, trying to maintain her composure. Anna, would you discreetly inform Lord Ionescu that I need to speak with him at his earliest convenience? It's a matter of some importance. As Anna hurried away, Mara paced her chamber, mind racing. If Elisabetta had aligned herself with the criminals behind the orphanage scheme, the danger had suddenly multiplied. But why would she involve herself in such a matter? What could she possibly gain? Before she could untangle these questions, the door opened without a preliminary knock. Elisabetta herself stood in the doorway, elegantly attired in a burgundy dinner gown that showcased her still youthful figure to advantage. So this is where Adrian has housed his companion, she said, her voice silky with disdain as she surveyed Mara's chambers. Rather generous accommodations for a servant, wouldn't you agree? Mara rose, refusing to be intimidated in her own space. "Can I help you with something, Lady Ionescu?" Elisabetta laughed, a brittle sound devoid of humor. "How formal we are, especially given the rumors of your familiarity with my husband." She moved into the room uninvited, trailing her fingers across Mara's possessions with proprietary ease. "I've come to offer you a proposition, Miss Dobre." "I'm listening," Mara replied, maintaining a calm she did not feel. "Leave Ionescu Manor," Elisabetta stated bluntly. "Tonight, I'll provide generous compensation, enough to establish yourself comfortably elsewhere." Her smile was sharp as a blade. "Perhaps even enough to support a child, should you have one." The reference to a child sent a chill through Mara. "You've been speaking with some interesting associates," she observed, keeping her voice level. "Men with distinctive scars." A flicker of surprise crossed Elisabetta's perfect features before her composure returned. "I have many acquaintances," she replied dismissively. "The point is, your presence here is no longer required or desired. Adrian may have been diverted by you during my absence, but I have returned to claim my rightful place." "Your rightful place?" Mara echoed, unable to contain her incredulity. "The one you voluntarily abandoned 7 years ago without a word?" Elisabetta's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You know nothing about my reasons for leaving." "I know you left a man who spent years searching for you," Mara replied evenly. "Who wrote letters you would never read, who questioned what he might have done differently." "How touching," Elisabetta sneered. "You've clearly wormed your way into his confidences as thoroughly as his bed." She stepped closer, her expression hardening. "But understand this. I am Lady Ionescu. That title, this house, and its master remain legally mine, regardless of my absence. You are nothing more than a temporary distraction." Mara held her ground, meeting the other woman's gaze directly. "If you truly believe that, you wouldn't be here offering me money to leave." For an instant, genuine anger flashed in Elisabetta's eyes. "Don't overestimate your importance. Adrian has always been susceptible to a pretty face paired with a sad story. Once the novelty wears off, he'll remember where his true obligations lie." "With a wife who only returned when her other prospects failed?" Mara challenged softly. "Who even now aligns herself with criminals to secure her position?" Elisabetta's hand struck before Mara could anticipate it, the slap ringing sharply in the quiet room. "How dare you? Is this a social call, Elisabetta? Or are you simply demonstrating your suitability as mistress of this house?" Adrian's cold voice from the doorway froze both women in place. He stood on the threshold, his expression a mask of controlled fury as he surveyed the scene. "This servant was insolent," Elisabetta declared, quickly composing herself. "I was merely assaulting a member of my household in her private chambers after entering without permission," Adrian finished for her. "Hardly the behavior of a lady, much less the mistress of Ionescu Manor." Elisabetta's posture shifted subtly, her angular features softening into a practiced look of wounded dignity. "Adrian, darling, surely you understand my distress. To return home and find another woman has usurped my place." "You usurped nothing, Elisabetta," Adrian interrupted coldly. "You abandoned it, thoroughly and completely, with no explanation and no farewell." He stepped into the room, his presence commanding the space. "Now you return, not out of affection or duty, but because Count Himmler tired of supporting you." Color flooded Elisabetta's cheeks. "That's unfair." "No, what's unfair is your treatment of Miss Dobre, who has shown more loyalty to this household in months than you did in years of marriage." Adrian's voice was implacable. "I've allowed you temporary accommodation out of basic courtesy, not obligation. That courtesy expires with this behavior." Elisabetta's eyes narrowed as she assessed the immovability of Adrian's position. Then, with the adaptability that had always been her hallmark, she changed tactics. "Very well," she said, her voice cooling to match his. "I see you're determined to defend your arrangement. But consider carefully, Adrian. Society has expectations of men in your position. The scandal of openly rejecting your wife for a servant will not be easily weathered. She glanced contemptuously at Mara. Especially when that servant has secrets of her own to hide. A bastard child, perhaps? One whose custody might be complicated by public scrutiny. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air. Mara's heart raced as she realized how much Elisabetta must have learned from her mysterious visitor. "Are you threatening Miss Dobry?" Adrian asked, his voice dangerously soft. Elisabetta smiled coldly. "Merely stating facts, darling. Everyone has vulnerabilities. Miss Dobry's happened to involve a certain child whose parentage might interest the authorities in Brasov." Adrian's expression would have chilled the bravest soul. "You've made a critical error, Elisabetta, not in threatening Mara, though that alone would ensure my opposition, but in aligning yourself with criminals involved in child trafficking." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to an ominous whisper. "Did you truly believe I wouldn't discover your connection to the men who threatened us in Bucharest? The same men who facilitated the illegal adoption scheme at St. Nicholas Orphanage?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Elisabetta's face. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Your visitor this morning made that connection quite clear," Adrian replied. "And now, so have you, with your veiled threats about Mara's son." Elisabetta's composure faltered momentarily before she rallied. "Even if that were true, you can hardly afford a public scandal. Your position, your standing in society, are far more secure than the freedom of those who steal children from their mothers." Adrian finished for her. "Choose your next steps carefully, Elisabetta. The law may still recognize our marriage, but it also recognizes conspiracy and extortion." The tension in the room was palpable, as husband and wife faced each other. Years of resentment and betrayal crystallized in this single confrontation. Finally, Elisabetta broke the stalemate with a brittle laugh. "You've changed, Adrian," she observed, a hint of genuine surprise in her voice. "The man I left would never have spoken to me this way." "The man you left died in your absence," Adrian replied quietly. "Someone else has taken his place." Something flickered in Elisabetta's eyes, perhaps regret, perhaps mere calculation. "So I see." She turned toward the door, then paused to glance back at Mara. "He'll tire of you too eventually. Adrian has never been one for permanence." With that parting barb, she swept from the room, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Adrian exhaled slowly, some of the rigid tension leaving his body. "Are you all right?" he asked Mara, concern replacing anger in his eyes. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her cheek still stung from Elisabetta's slap. "But I'm worried about what she knows about Petru. The visitor Anna described was almost certainly one of the men who threatened us in Bucharest." Adrian nodded grimly. "I suspected as much when I heard the description. Somehow Elisabetta has connected herself to this adoption scheme, whether through prior knowledge or recent opportunity." "What will she do now?" Mara asked, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "Something desperate, I imagine," Adrian replied thoughtfully. "Elisabetta has never responded well to direct confrontation. She prefers subtle manipulations to open warfare." He moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened grounds. "We'll need to warn the Antonescus. If she's aligned with these criminals, Petru could be at risk." The thought sent a chill through Mara's heart. "Should we return to Brasov immediately?" Adrian turned back to her, his expression resolute. "First thing tomorrow. Tonight we secure the household and ensure Elisabetta has no opportunity to cause further mischief." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle. "I'm sorry you've been drawn into this ugliness, Mara." "It's not your doing," she replied softly. "And compared to finding my son, these are minor obstacles." His lips curved in a faint smile of admiration. "Your courage continues to astonish me." The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "But Elisabetta is dangerous when cornered. Until we resolve this situation, we must be vigilant." As if to emphasize his warning, a commotion erupted downstairs, raised voices and hurried footsteps. Adrian tensed, moving swiftly to the door with Mara close behind. In the grand entrance hall below, Vasile was engaged in heated conversation with a visitor, a distinguished-looking man whose aristocratic bearing marked him as someone of consequence. "Count Dragomir," Adrian murmured in surprise, recognizing his former friend. What could possibly bring Nikolai here at this hour? They descended the stairs together, the Count looking up at their approach with an expression of grim determination. "Adrian," he greeted formally. "Miss Dobre, I apologize for the late intrusion, but I bring news that couldn't wait until morning." His voice lowered. "It concerns your wife, a child in Brasov, and certain unsavory characters who have been asking far too many questions about both of you." The study fire cast long shadows across the room as Adrian, Mara, and Count Dragomir gathered around the brandy that Vasile had hastily provided. Outside, winter darkness had fully descended, and with it came a sense of urgency that hung in the air like a tangible presence. "Start from the beginning," Adrian instructed Nikolai, his voice controlled despite the tension evident in his posture. "How did you come to know about Mara's son?" The Count swirled the amber liquid in his glass thoughtfully. "My family has long-standing business interests near Brasov. One of my estate managers reported unusual inquiries being made about the Antonescu family, specifically about their son." His gaze shifted to Mara. "When I investigated further, I uncovered the connection to St. Nicholas Orphanage and the questionable adoptions that occurred there." "And Elisabetta?" Adrian prompted. "How does she factor into this?" Nikolai's expression darkened. "That's where matters become truly concerning. It seems your wife has been collaborating with a man named Gavril Stănescu, a former administrator at St. Nicholas who orchestrated many of these illegal adoptions." Mara leaned forward, her heart racing. "The scarred man from Bucharest?" "One of Stănescu's enforcers," Nikolai confirmed. "They've been attempting to silence anyone who might expose their operation. When Elisabetta returned and learned of your interest in the Antonescu boy, she apparently saw an opportunity to secure her position by threatening Mara through her son," Adrian concluded grimly. "But why would Stănescu align with her? What does he gain?" "Protection," Nikolai replied simply. "Your wife has connections in Vienna, influential people who could help bury the scandal if it threatens to spread beyond Romania's borders. Many prominent European families unwittingly adopted children through Stănescu's network." Adrian's jaw tightened as he rose to pace before the fire. "And now?" "My sources indicate Stănescu's men are watching the Antonescu estate," Nikolai said, his tone grave. "Whether they intend to silence the family or simply monitor the situation is unclear. But with Elisabetta's involvement..." He left the implication hanging. Mara felt cold fear grip her heart. "The boy is in danger," she whispered. "They might take him again, or worse." "We'll leave for Brasov at first light," Adrian decided, turning back to face them. "Nikolai, I must ask, why are you helping us? After 7 years of estrangement..." The Count set down his glass with deliberate care. "My father died last month," he said quietly. "On his deathbed, he confessed that he had been wrong about you, that the rumors he believed were falsehoods spread by someone with a vendetta against your family." His eyes met Adrian's directly. "He asked me to make amends if I could." A complex mix of emotions crossed Adrian's face: pain, vindication, and a reluctant softening. "Who spread these rumors?" "Stănescu," Nikolai revealed. "It seems he feared your influence might expose his operations if you became too interested in orphanage governance. He orchestrated your social isolation deliberately." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Adrian braced himself against the mantelpiece, absorbing the implications of this betrayal that had cost him years of friendship and community. "All this time," he murmured, "I believed your father had simply turned against me out of snobbery or prejudice." "He was manipulated, as were many others," Nikolai replied. "Stănescu proved remarkably skilled at turning minor incidents into damning narratives." A sharp knock interrupted their conversation as Vasile entered with uncharacteristic haste. "My lord, forgive the intrusion, but Lady Ionescu's carriage has just departed the estate." "When?" Adrian demanded. "Not 5 minutes ago, my lord. She gave no destination but ordered the driver to make haste." The three exchanged alarmed glances. "Brasov," they said in near unison. "She must have overheard our conversation," Mara realized with growing dread. "She's going to warn Stănescu that we know about his operation." "Or worse," Adrian said grimly, "she might attempt to use Petru as leverage." He turned to Vasile. Have my fastest horses saddled immediately. We leave within the hour. The mountain passes will be treacherous at night, Nikolai warned. Perhaps we should wait. Every hour gives Elisabetta more advantage, Adrian interrupted. I won't risk Mara's son becoming a pawn in whatever desperate game my wife is playing. As Vasile hurried to execute the orders, Mara touched Adrian's arm gently. Let me come with you, she pleaded. He's my son. Adrian studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Of course. This is your battle as much as mine. He glanced at Nikolai. Will you join us, Count Dragomir? Your knowledge of the local authorities in Brasov could prove invaluable. I would consider it an honor, Nikolai replied formally, and perhaps the beginning of restitution for my family's role in your isolation. Within the hour, 3 riders departed Ionescu Manor, their horses' hooves muffled by fresh snow as they raced against time and treachery toward Brasov. The journey through the winter night was arduous, the mountain paths treacherous with ice and shadow. They pushed their mounts as hard as they dared, stopping only when absolutely necessary to rest the horses. By dawn, they had made remarkable progress, benefiting from Nikolai's knowledge of lesser-known shortcuts through the Carpathian foothills. As they approached a small village where they planned a brief stop to change horses, Mara spotted a familiar carriage outside the local inn. Elisabetta's conveyance, the Ionescu crest visible on its door. She's here, Mara whispered urgently, signaling to Adrian and Nikolai. Adrian's expression hardened as he dismounted. We'll approach separately. Nikolai, secure the rear exit. Mara, stay with me, but remain inconspicuous. If Stănescu's men are with her, they'll recognize you immediately. The common room of the inn was nearly empty at this early hour, just a few bleary-eyed travelers breaking their fast before continuing their journeys. Elisabetta sat alone by the fire, her elegant traveling clothes marking her as distinctly out of place in the rustic establishment. She looked up as the door opened, her composure faltering momentarily at the sight of Adrian and Mara. Well, she remarked, recovering quickly, this is an unexpected pleasure. Have you come to escort me back to the manor, husband? Adrian approached her table with deceptive calm. Where is Stănescu? The direct question visibly startled her. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't insult our intelligence, Elisabetta, Adrian replied coldly. We know about your arrangement with him, about the orphanage, about everything. A flicker of calculation crossed her features before she sighed dramatically. Very well. Yes, I've had dealings with Stănescu. He approached me in Vienna some months ago, aware of my financial difficulties, and offered a solution. Her lips curved in a bitter smile. All I had to do was return to Romania, reclaim my position as your wife, and ensure certain inquiries about St. Nicholas Orphanage didn't progress too far. You would threaten an innocent child to secure your comfort? Mara asked incredulously. Elisabetta's gaze shifted to her, cold and assessing. I would do what necessary to survive, Miss Dobre. Not all of us have the luxury of Adrian's protection and wealth. She turned back to Adrian. Though I admit, I underestimated how thoroughly she had secured your loyalty. Where is Stănescu now? Adrian demanded, ignoring the barb. On his way to Brasov, I imagine. Elisabetta replied with affected casualness. Though you needn't worry about the Antonescu boy. Stănescu has no interest in harming him. That would only draw unwanted attention. He merely wishes to ensure the adoption scandal remains contained. By threatening those who might expose it, Adrian concluded grimly. Elisabetta shrugged elegantly. Business is business, darling. Surely you understand that. Before either could respond, Nikolai appeared at Adrian's shoulder. We need to leave, he said urgently. 2 of Stănescu's men just arrived. They're stabling their horses now. Adrian gripped Elisabetta's wrist as she moved to rise. You're coming with us, he informed her, his voice brooking no argument. I won't have you warning them of our approach. Don't be absurd, she hissed, attempting to pull away. I have no intention of... Your intentions ceased to matter the moment you aligned yourself with criminals threatening a child, Adrian interrupted coldly. You will accompany us to Brasov, where you will publicly disavow any connection to Stănescu. Only then will we discuss what becomes of our marriage. Something in his implacable tone must have convinced her of his seriousness, for Elisabetta ceased her resistance. "Very well," she conceded with poor grace. "Though I maintain I've done nothing legally wrong. Morally, however," Mara observed quietly, "is another matter entirely." They departed swiftly, taking Elisabetta's carriage while leaving her driver with instructions to follow at a more leisurely pace. With fresh horses and Nikolai's expert navigation, they made excellent time, reaching Brasov by mid-afternoon. Their first stop was the Golden Stag, where they hoped to find Dalka. The investigator had remained in the town to monitor the Antonescu estate and gather additional evidence about Stănescu's operation. To their dismay, the innkeeper reported that Dalka had left urgently that morning following a message delivered from the Antonescu estate. "Did he say what the message contained?" Adrian asked, a sense of foreboding growing within him. "Only that there was trouble with the boy," the innkeeper replied, his expression concerned. He seemed most alarmed. Mara's face paled. "We need to go there immediately." They wasted no time, leaving Elisabetta under Nikolai's watchful eye at the inn while Adrian and Mara raced to the Antonescu estate. As they approached the imposing gates, they were met by an unusual sight. The property seemed deserted, with no stable hands visible, and the main house shuttered despite the early hour. "Something's wrong," Mara whispered, her maternal instincts screaming in alarm. They dismounted cautiously, approaching the main entrance on foot. Adrian knocked firmly, the sound echoing ominously in the unnatural silence that engulfed the estate. After a long moment, the door opened a crack to reveal Elena Antonescu's pale face. When she recognized them, relief flooded her features. "Thank God," she breathed, opening the door wider to admit them. "We feared you wouldn't come in time." "What's happened?" Mara demanded, stepping into the dimly lit entrance hall. "Where is Petru?" "Safe, for the moment," Elena assured her, leading them quickly toward the rear of the house. "But Stănescu's men have been watching the estate since yesterday. This morning they attempted to take him during his riding lesson." Mara's heart froze. "Attempted?" "Victor's gamekeeper intervened," Elena explained, her voice shaking slightly. "There was a struggle. The man was injured, but he managed to bring Petru safely back to the house." She paused outside a heavy oak door. "We've been hiding here since. Victor has the remaining staff armed and patrolling the grounds." She opened the door to reveal a cozy library, where Petru sat before the fire with Victor and Dalka, engaged in what appeared to be an intense game of chess. The boy looked up as they entered, his solemn eyes widening with recognition as they fell on Mara. "It's you," he said simply, "the lady from the stables who seemed familiar." Mara could barely breathe past the emotion constricting her throat. "Yes," she managed. "Hello, Petru." The name, his true name, seemed to resonate within him. He tilted his head curiously. "You called me Petru, but my name is Nikolai." "It's a long story," Victor interjected, rising to greet Adrian with evident relief. "One we were just beginning to share with him when you arrived." Dalka approached Adrian, his expression grave. "Stănescu himself is in Brasov," he reported quietly. "My sources say he's desperate. The investigation has progressed too far for him to simply silence a few witnesses. He means to take the boy and flee the country." "We won't let that happen," Adrian vowed, his voice resolute. "The authorities are compromised," Dalka finished grimly, "at least locally. Stănescu has bribed key officials to look the other way." Mara had moved closer to Petru, who watched her with the intense curiosity of childhood. "You said you know a story about my name," he prompted, seemingly untroubled by the adult tensions swirling around him. "I do," Mara confirmed softly, kneeling to meet his gaze at eye level. "It's about a little boy who was born to a mother who loved him very much, but who was taken from her through a cruel deception." Petru's intelligent eyes studied her face. "Was the boy's name Petru?" "Yes," Mara whispered, her heart in her throat. "Petru Dobre." "That's a good name," he decided after a thoughtful moment. "Better than Nicolae Antonescu." He glanced toward Elena and Victor. "Though I would miss being an Antonescu if I had to be a Dobre instead." "Perhaps you could be both," Elena suggested gently, moving to stand beside Victor. That's what we've been discussing, dear one. How you are fortunate enough to have two families who care for you. The boy's brow furrowed in concentration as he processed this extraordinary possibility. Are you saying? He began, his gaze returning to Mara with sudden intensity. That you're my real mother? The direct question, so typically childlike in its simplicity, momentarily robbed Mara of speech. Yes, she finally managed, tears welling in her eyes. I am your mother, Petru. Your birth mother. Instead of the confusion or distress the adults might have feared, Petru's face lit with an expression of wonder. I knew it, he whispered. I've dreamed about you. A lady with chestnut hair who sang to me about stars. The lullaby. Her lullaby that she had sung to him every night of his early life. Mara couldn't contain her tears now. You remember, she breathed. Not everything, he admitted. Just feelings mostly. And the song. His eyes, so like her own, studied her with heartbreaking earnestness. If you're my real mother, why didn't you find me before? Because I thought you had died, Mara explained, her voice thick with emotion. I was told you were gone forever, and by the time I learned otherwise, you were already here, with your new family. Petru considered this with remarkable composure for a child his age. So I have two mothers now, he concluded pragmatically. And two fathers? He glanced curiously at Adrian, who had moved to stand protectively near Mara. No, Mara corrected gently. Lord Ionescu is a dear friend who helped me find you again. He looks at you the way Papa looks at Mama sometimes, Petru observed innocently, causing both Adrian and Mara to flush slightly, while Victor cleared his throat awkwardly. The moment of familial warmth was shattered by the sudden sound of breaking glass from another part of the house, followed by shouts and the unmistakable report of a pistol. They're here, Dalka said grimly, drawing his own weapon. Stănescu must have grown impatient. Victor moved swiftly to a cabinet, retrieving a hunting rifle. The passage, he instructed his wife urgently. Take the boy and Miss Dobry through the hidden passage to the stables. There are horses waiting. Elena nodded, her aristocratic composure remarkable in the crisis. Come, she said, moving to a bookshelf and triggering a hidden mechanism that caused the entire unit to swing forward, revealing a narrow stone corridor beyond. This was built during the Ottoman invasions. It will lead us to safety. Adrian gripped Mara's arm as she prepared to follow. Be careful, he murmured, his eyes conveying everything his words could not in that moment. I'll find you once we've dealt with Stănescu. Promise me you'll come, she whispered, fear for him momentarily overshadowing even her concern for Petru. His response was a swift, fierce kiss that left her breathless. Nothing could prevent it, he vowed against her lips. Petru watched this exchange with undisguised interest before Elena gently urged him toward the passage. Mara followed, casting one last glance at Adrian, tall and determined beside Dalka and Victor as they prepared to confront the intruders. The passage was narrow but navigable, even for Elena in her voluminous skirts. Petru moved ahead confidently, seemingly treating the entire experience as a grand adventure rather than a desperate flight. I've explored all the secret places in the house, he informed Mara proudly as they descended a rough-hewn staircase. Though Mama doesn't usually let me use this one. For good reason, Elena remarked from behind them. It's not entirely stable in places. Stay close to the right wall when we reach the next section. The passage eventually opened into a small chamber connected to the stables. As promised, 3 horses stood ready, already saddled and provisioned for a journey. We'll ride for my sister's estate, Elena explained as they prepared to mount. It's less than 10 miles east, and Stănescu would have no reason to look for us there. As they led the horses into the stable yard, however, they found their path blocked by a figure that made Mara's blood run cold, Elisabeta, flanked by 2 rough-looking men, including the scarred enforcer from Bucharest. Leaving so soon? Elisabeta inquired pleasantly. And with such precious cargo. Her gaze lingered on Petru, who instinctively moved closer to Mara. How did you find us? Mara demanded, positioning herself protectively before her son. Your Count Dragomir isn't quite as reformed as he pretends, Elisabetta replied with a cold smile. Old loyalties die hard, it seems. She gestured to her companions. Now we'll be taking the boy. Stănescu has arrangements for him that will ensure everyone's continued discretion. You'll have to kill me first, Mara stated flatly, her maternal instinct overriding all fear. Elisabetta sighed theatrically. Such melodrama. No one needs to die, Miss Dobre. Simply step aside and allow the natural order to reassert itself. The boy belongs with a proper family, not a servant with delusions of motherhood. I am his mother, Mara declared, her voice steady and clear. By blood, by right, and by love that never died even when I believed him lost forever. Before Elisabetta could respond, the unmistakable sound of galloping horses approached from the direction of the main house. Adrian, Dalka, and Victor burst into the stable yard, weapons drawn. Step away from them, Elisabetta, Adrian commanded, his voice like ice. The scarred man reached for his pistol, but froze as multiple rifles trained on him from the stable roof. The Antonescu gamekeeper and several loyal servants had positioned themselves as sharpshooters during the confrontation. It's over, Adrian continued, dismounting smoothly. Stănescu has been arrested by royal authorities in Brașov. Count Dragomir's father may have been deceived, but the son proved considerably more loyal. He contacted the king's personal envoy the moment we left him at the inn. Elisabetta's composure finally cracked, disbelief and fury warring in her expression. You're lying. I'm afraid not, my lady, Dalka confirmed, producing an official-looking document. This warrant authorizes the arrest of Gavril Stănescu and all his known associates on charges of child trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. He gestured to the scarred man and his companion, including these gentlemen, and potentially yourself. The scarred enforcer glanced between Dalka's warrant and the rifles aimed at him, then slowly raised his hands in surrender. His companion followed suit, leaving Elisabetta standing alone in her defiance. This is absurd, she sputtered. I'm Lady Ionescu. You cannot possibly— You ceased to be Lady Ionescu in any meaningful sense the day you abandoned your home and husband. Adrian interrupted coldly. The legal dissolution will merely formalize what has already occurred in truth. As Dalka moved to secure Elisabetta and her companions, Petru tugged at Mara's hand. Is it over now? He asked quietly. Can we all go home? The simple question contained worlds of complexity, but as Mara looked from Petru to Adrian, then to Elena and Victor, she felt a surprising clarity emerge from the chaos of recent events. Yes, she answered, kneeling to embrace him properly for the first time in 5 long years. We can all go home now, together. 3 months later, Ionescu Manor bloomed with spring's renewal. The grand ballroom, unopened for nearly a decade, glittered with candlelight as the first social gathering in years unfolded within its walls. The occasion was ostensibly a celebration of Adrian's formal appointment to the Royal Council, a position that acknowledged both his restored standing in society and his instrumental role in exposing the orphanage scandal. In reality, it was a more personal milestone being marked, the official beginning of a new chapter for the household. In a quiet corner of the ballroom, Mara stood watching the dancers, still somewhat amazed at her transformed circumstances. Her simple black gowns had given way to an elegant emerald creation that complemented her chestnut hair, now styled in fashionable curls rather than the severe bun of her housekeeper days. The legal dissolution of Adrian's marriage to Elisabetta had proceeded with surprising swiftness once the full extent of her involvement with Stănescu came to light. She had been permitted to return to Vienna with her reputation damaged, but her freedom intact, a leniency Adrian had granted largely for the sake of their shared past, though there was little warmth in the gesture. More complex had been the arrangement regarding Petru. After much negotiation and soul-searching on all sides, an unprecedented solution had emerged. The boy would divide his time between Ionescu Manor and the Antonescu estate, maintaining relationships with both families while gradually learning the truth of his origins. To Mara's continual amazement, he had adapted to this unusual situation with remarkable resilience, seeming to thrive on the expanded horizons his dual family provided. Currently, he was charming a group of noble children with tales of secret passages and midnight adventures, his natural confidence making him the center of attention despite his unusual background. "He has your spirit," Adrian's voice came from behind her, warm with affection, "and your ability to win hearts without effort." Mara turned to face him, her own heart still quickening at his presence despite the months of close companionship they had shared. "He has your diplomatic skills," she countered with a smile. "I've never seen a child so adept at managing adults." Adrian laughed, the sound still surprising to those who remembered only his years of bitter isolation. "A useful trait in any household, but particularly in one as unconventional as ours has become." His expression softened as he took her hand, his thumb brushing over the simple gold band that now adorned her finger. "Are you happy, Mara, with this life we've created?" The question held echoes of the vulnerability he rarely showed to others but had come to share with her freely. Mara looked around the ballroom, at Petru gesturing dramatically to his enraptured audience, at the Antonescus conversing comfortably with Count Dragomir, at the staff who had transformed from servants to something closer to family during the tumultuous events of the past year. "I never dreamed such happiness was possible," she answered honestly. "To have found my son, to have found you." She met his gaze directly, allowing him to see the depth of emotion she no longer needed to conceal. "Yes, Adrian. I am happier than I ever believed possible." His smile, warm and intimate and meant only for her, was still a revelation, even after their quiet wedding 2 weeks prior. "Then shall we scandalize society one final time this evening?" he suggested, his eyes dancing with mischief. "How so, my lord husband?" she inquired, arching an eyebrow playfully. In answer, Adrian drew her into his arms, there in full view of Romania's assembled nobility, and kissed his former housekeeper with unmistakable passion and tenderness. As applause, led enthusiastically by Petru, rippled through the ballroom, Mara surrendered to the embrace, to the love, and to the extraordinary journey that had led them both from darkness into light. Their path had been neither conventional nor easy, but standing in the circle of Adrian's arms, with her son's laughter ringing in her ears, Mara knew with absolute certainty that they had found their way home at last.